outcomes for children. A shift from thinking about just what we need to buy in terms of textbooks or classrooms or teachers, to thinking about what we actually are all trying to achieve, which is learning for children. And this panel, each and every one of these panelists have been doing transformative research in various ways, trying to help with that great conceptual shift. And I can assure you that coming from a global research position, the work of these members actually is helping shift thinking across the globe. And so it is a great pleasure for me to introduce your first speaker. In fact, he needs no introduction. I think all of you know very well Dr. Faisal Barry. He is indeed one of the top economists. Over 20 years of experience in education, working not just on the details of education, but on the wider issues like social protection, industrial organization, and economic development. He is an assistant professor in Lahore in the university in the management section at LUMS. He is also a teaching relating to all kinds of issues, including inclusive education, philosophy of education, microeconomics, game theory, and much more. He's now the Dean for LUMS and was very generous enough to host us recently to debate some of these big issues. He's a senior research fellow at IDEAS and was previously the CEO there. He's the executive director for another development center and a visiting associate professor at Yale. It goes on. So he's worked, of course, with many of the big development agencies, ADB and the World Bank, DFID, CEDA, and UNDP. He was also a former Rhodes Scholar and has got his BA from Oxford and a doctorate from McGill. I think many of you will know his publications, and it's a great pleasure for us to have him on the panel today. Welcome, Dr. Faisal Barry.
Actually, thank you very much, though Rachel was very kind both in introducing me and also saying that the other panel is good. Don't worry about the other panel. Forget that. This is the panel to be at. We're going to have a very interesting, I think, debate on delivery and delivery of, obviously, education and how to think about that. But I'll come to that in a moment. First, let me just introduce the entire panel to you, and then we'll go into requesting Niloufar to start. So in terms of introduction, we have Niloufar Javed here, Senior Advisor, Education Commission, 20 plus years of experience at the Education Commission, World Bank, FCDO, CEDA, has done some very complex projects in very challenging circumstances. Niloufar, thank you very much for joining us. And of course, Education Commission is the one that has been, that is behind the funding for this delivery project that we are doing. We have two people joining us who will be presenting the Pakistan case. Online, we'll have Rabia Malik, who's the CEO for IDEAS, was a faculty member at LUMS, and a PhD from University of Cambridge. We just have to forgive her for that. She should have gone to Oxford, but anyway. So PhD from Cambridge, and we've been working for 10, 15 years together. Saad Gulzar. Dr. Saad Gulzar is Assistant Professor of Politics and International Affairs at Princeton. He was, before Princeton, he was Assistant Professor at Stanford, PhD from NYU. Saad and I think Dan Roger, whose work we will refer to separate from this work also, did the quantitative part of the study. Rabia, myself, and a team from IDEAS, we did the qualitative part of the study. Among the panelists who are here, In no particular order, Dr. Bela Jamil. Dr. Bela Jamil. I mean, one doesn't say anything more than Dr. Bela Jamil. Bela is here. Ehtisham Anwar Saab. Ehtisham Saab is Commissioner for Bahawalpur right now, but he was the Education Secretary for South Punjab. And in the different panel just now, we heard about his recent initiatives on opening up transgender schools in South Punjab that are now opening up in Lahore as well. Javed Malik Saab is Director for Malala Fund. He was also one of the leading people for DFID who worked on the PEST program, an author of 2 books, and by the way, both books are very good. And I'm waiting for the third one that will come out of his doctoral work now, inshallah. Dr. Saab, thank you very much for joining us. And last but not least, of course, Mr. Naveed Aziz Saab. Naveed Saab is at FCDO. He is the lead governance advisor, has previously worked at the World Bank as well, masters from Columbia University. So, without further ado, Nilofer, could I request you to set up the study and the context, and then we'll come to the 2 presentations for the Pakistan work, and then go to the panel for a richer discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Faisal, and I'm really honored to be here among such a large group of experts. And the and I'm definitely not the expert here, because the experts are the ones who have done the research. You know, they are the ones who will be sharing their findings, and I'll just give an overview of the delivery transformation strand of the Education Commission and the work that it has been doing, what was behind, you know, the core objective of the Education Commission, of DeliverEd, what we are trying to do, what we are trying to achieve, what is it that we want to look at, the key research questions, and I'll also share a glimpse or a flavor of the 5 country studies that we are currently going on. So I'll start with the core objectives of DeliverEd, and I would also like to share what SN Iqbal Saab, the minister, said yesterday about we have not been short of policies. It's implementation that we lack, and this is exactly what DeliverEd and the delivery transformation is about. So I just wanted to, the real challenge is implementation. So I think that's, you know, to put it in a nutshell, that's what DeliverEd is about. So there is a growing recognition on the challenges of delivery, but limited evidence. Can we have the first slide? Presentation jo meri hai usko. Yeah, go to the second slide, please. So it's not only, there's very limited evidence on what's working in delivery approaches and what's not. And there are only a dozen or so papers, but none of them are in low or middle income countries, and most of it's gray literature. So governments need more evidence of what's working. Donors need more evidence about what the impact is of these particular delivery approaches. So the goal of the project is to enable more effective implementation of education reform so that governments are able to deliver, they know how best to deliver. And the aim is to fill the gap in the evidence and generate knowledge. So what we are doing is we are trying to produce high quality research with our different partners, which I'll touch upon a bit later, so that it's, you know, peer reviewed, it's like of international standards, and we can then disseminate the evidence and the results with governments, with policymakers, political leadership, and practitioners on how to implement education reforms that impact learning. I'll try to be very brief. The theory of change, in the next slide, please. So the theory of change, I don't know whether you can see it or not, but it's about, starting from political ownership. And those of you who have worked on the education roadmap in Punjab, they know what the key elements are, so I won't go into great detail, but just to sort of maybe refresh your memory, it's about political ownership, whether it's at the national level or at the subnational level. It's about the management routines that these units or approaches adopt. And then what is the impact on the knowledge behaviors of the managers who are responsible for implementation at the lower levels? What sort of policies are implemented, and how does this impact learning outcomes of children? So basically, when the Deliver It program started, we are in partnership with University of Oxford, the Blavatsky School of Government, who did a literature review about what delivery approaches are, and they came up with a definition and a conceptual framework. Next slide, please. So basically, what are delivery approaches? I'm so sorry you can't see the whole, the whole thing, but it's an institutionalized unit or structured process with, thank you. Process within a government bureaucracy, and here we know in Pakistan, the bureaucracy is responsible for delivery. That aims to rapidly improve bureaucratic functioning and policy delivery, and combining managerial functions in a varied way. So it differs from context to context, which I'll touch upon a bit later. And the main aim is, as Rachel said, is to shift the attention from inputs and processes to more outcomes and outputs, but basically more outcomes. So this is based on a literature review, and the 5 key elements that the BSG came up with. This conceptual framework was developed by BSG under the Deliver It program. So it's basically how do these unique managerial functions come together in a unit or an approach, and then how are these used to influence policy, and we can see some common functions, how do governments prioritize, how do they set the targets, how are then these targets measured, monitored, and then it's about political sponsorship. How are the accountability routines set in? What are the incentives, if there are any? And last and not least is about problem solving and adaptation or organizational learning. How do organizations work together to achieve that common goal? This is the first product that Deliver It did, was an interactive digital map and database of global delivery approaches. And when I was appearing for my interview, I went and I visited the website, and I was really surprised because there are over 100, मेरे ख्याल में था कि सिर्फ पंजाब में हम लोगों ने की है, या 1 or 2 other countries, but it's across 150 plus delivery approaches across 80 countries. And that was a real, so this map was developed just to give, and it's an interactive map, so you can go and, click on it, and it can, there's a lot of information in there. And basically, what we found was that 61% had cross-sectoral approaches, and 39% had single sector approaches focused on, so almost 40% focused on education. So that was a real sort of eye-opener for me, at least. Next slide. So what are the key research questions? Now, these are very high-level questions. Are delivery approaches effective in improving policy implementation and service delivery? And if so, how and why? But these are at a very high level, so when we look at each country case study, we go into more detail, and we also look at the different context of the delivery units or approaches. And we sometimes use delivery units and approaches a bit interchangeably, but delivery unit is a more sort of unit central, and approach is a bit, we use it in a more wider sense. So basically, what is the structure of the unit or approach? What does it achieve? What does it, what are the successes, and if so, how did it achieve whatever it did, or if not, then what hindered the achievement of goals. And so those are basically the sort of questions that we look at. These are the 5 country research studies that are currently ongoing, and except for, and Pakistan is one of them, which you'll hear a bit in more detail. And there's Ghana. Ghana is the only one where we are doing a prospective study, because the delivery unit there at the national and at the delivery approach at the sub-national level is also ongoing. There's Jordan, where we have a retrospective analysis, Sierra Leone, retrospective, and Tanzania is ongoing. So the results of all the first 4 we've got, and the Tanzania one is a bit delayed, which we'll get the initial findings and like more details by the end of June. But this is, and Sierra Leone is the only one that was done in-house by the Commission, by the deliberate team. The rest of the studies have been done with our local partners, with University of Oxford, Global University of Toronto, which I'll share the slide who our key partners are. But they have all been done by the universities and by the key organizations at the local level. So Ghana, just to give you a quick overview, the national, so Ghana is a bit like, it has a national level, 17 agencies, Ministry of Education established in the NERS, the National Education Reform Secretariat, established in 2019 with support from the UK government. And it's interesting to see that initially it was focused on target setting, establishing performance contracts. There were accounting to the minister. So the routines that we are all familiar with, the regular meetings, but those evolved over the years to more problem solving and improved coordination across the agencies. And at the sub-national level also, because there's a regional, there's a district level, and then you go down to the school level. So a lot of things have been happening. Next slide, please. I'll quickly go through and the research design is we had a national level study and then 2 rounds of district study. One was a baseline followed by a round of another study, and then we also had a large survey. So 3-4 types of studies and surveys that were going on, and now everything, we are in the process of pulling everything together and synthesizing the research into a report. Next slide, please. I'll quickly go through these are the conceptual framework that I talked about. So each country's study has been assessed or has been contextualized within that framework. I won't go into the detail because otherwise it will take a lot of time. But there's a great difference between the national and the sub-national level, for example, in Ghana, whether it's prioritization and target setting, whether it's, measurement and monitoring. You can see there's a difference. So at the national level, roadmaps were developed and great coordination across the 17 agencies. And although my colleague, differs with me on when I say, prioritization was done, and she says, no, how can you have 12 reform agencies? How do you call that prioritization? But anyways, that's the sort of, again, political sponsorship, very pronounced at the national level, but as you go down to the sub-national level, that's where, the sort of, there's a difference between the political sponsorship. Same about accountability and incentives, high stakes accountability, performance management contracts at the national level, but then when you go down, there's a great variation between the districts. And I talked about problem solve. Now the key findings, again, as I said, at the national level you can see a change. Then what the research team did was they looked at the management practices also. Oh, I've been given the 1 minute, which is not possible, but I'll try to wrap it up very quickly. So I can share the presentation and you can have access, and in case you want to have more details about the studies, we can also. So I'll quickly go, again, the key, I'll just touch upon the key findings. So at the national level, you can see the changes in the management practices, but as you go down to the sub-national level, there are many challenges due to resources, due to capacity, so a lot of variation in practices at the sub-national level. The second study is about Jordan, and Jordan is very different from Ghana, because here you see 3 delivery units. And because anybody who is familiar with Jordan, you know the political sort of context of Jordan. We have the Prime Minister's delivery unit at the Prime Minister's office, the Results and Effectiveness unit established at the Royal Court, and the Development Coordination unit at the Ministry of Education. Now, and just quickly, it was a qualitative study done by the Jordan research team at the University of Oxford. But quickly go to the findings. Skip a few slides. So again, you know, a lot of detail on these slides. Next. Again, you can see, you know, political sponsorship varies from the Royal Court, and some of them are very good at resolving issues about political and legal matters. Those are at the national level. Those are the PMDU and the R&D unit. Whereas the Development Coordination unit was more effective in solving technical and more complex, like technically complex issues, whereas the other 2 units were more effective in solving the political and politically sensitive issues. Next, please. So the key findings, so 3 units, and I always, like an optimist that I am, I always look at the 3 units, you know, what was it, what did it achieve? And for me, it was, they had a common goal. They wanted to improve student learning outcomes, and I think they did a good job. But when you have 3 units, you know, different multiple accountability mechanisms, reporting, misalignment between targets, and all those sort of challenges. But sometimes when you know, there is a change in the political government and you have 3 units which are still there, you have some sort of sustainability, which the Sierra Leone delivery unit is a smaller, you know, sort of rapid review that was done in-house. As I said, it was established in 2020, and it's basically to take forward the president and the minister's vision for education transformation and delivery of the free quality school program. Again, semi-structured virtual interviews with a small number of government officials from the delivery unit, from the development partners. And the same sort of framework was used, with high level of political sponsorship, but not so clear accountability and incentives process, measurement and monitoring. We did not see, there was a lack of data. But I'm really glad, and I think we can sort of share with you that yesterday we received the email that the government of Sierra Leone is happy with the policy note that we have shared with them, which has all the findings, and they are fine with us, so we are going to go ahead with the publication of the policy note. So that's really good news for us, because we were a bit, there was a bit of, the findings of the delivery approach are not so positive, and we were a bit, anxious about what the government would think. So yeah, political leadership, yes, definitely it's there, but utilization of that, but what the, one thing which I feel, just one thing which I think the delivery unit did was, so everything is not bad. What they did was they identified the gaps in policies, and that's what, they should not have been developing the policies, but they did a few good things also. But again, sustainability is an issue, prioritization, target setting, those are issues. I'm not going to skip there's no slide on Pakistan because that one will come in detail. Can we go to so overall lessons and takeaways? I think what we have learned is that delivery approaches come in all flavors and in all shapes, and they evolve over time. They are very dependent on the context in which they are set up. And one sort of key lesson is we have to assess the ground realities before a government chooses to start a delivery approach, because there are some prerequisites, I feel, which need to be there. Next slide, please. These are the research-based products that we have done till date. 2 policy notes, 4 working papers, and I think with the Sierra Leone policy note, I think it's 3. Over the next couple of months, we have a draft, we have a flagship report, which is sort of bringing together all the lessons, all the learning from the 5 country case studies, and what does it mean for policymakers, what are the key messages that we would like to give them. And it's not about being too prescriptive, it's about giving them what has worked and what has not worked. And these are our partners, University of Oxford, BSG, of course FCDO for their support, Rachel here, not only in terms of funding but in terms of supporting the vision for the research and to take it forward. And of course, the Ghana research was done by University of Cape Coast, Ghana. We have University of Toronto, and of course University of Oxford, and people like Bela here, who ITA is really, and ideas. Those are the local partners that we have. So it's not just University of Oxford sitting somewhere in the UK doing the research. We are working with local partners also. Thank you. But do let me know if you have any questions. I'm here. You can. Thank you.
So we'll come to the questions, and that will be more general. Researchers के लिए बड़ा मुश्किल होता है थोड़े टाइम में बात करना में. So I'll just set the context for the Pakistan study. We'll take just a few minutes. One, its period is 12 to 18, so it's a retrospective study. And it has two components. One is a quant study that I mentioned, which was done by Saad and Dan. And the qual study is Rabia, myself, and team from Ideas. The basic question, of course, everyone is looking for is how do you improve delivery in education? Right? And so what we are looking for is, are there generalizations? Did improvement happen? If it did, how did it happen? What actually changed? And we want to have a very detailed look at that from the Punjab experience, which chose to do the roadmap and the delivery unit and had high political ownership over that period as well. But there are many questions in this area which go to literature from, say, Lant Pritchett, where he asks, how do you do reform in large bureaucracies? Dan Honig's work about type A, type B, top-down, bottoms-up. How do you change the culture of bureaucracy? How do you change rules and regulations? How do you make them do something which is new or different, etc.? And also the Delhi work that Yamini Iyer and many others have done on the recent Delhi experiment as well, which is still ongoing and a very instructive one for us. So that's the kind of literature where you will see both of these qual and quant studies fit in. We talk about what changed, what was the route of the change, and more importantly, after 18, what stayed, what got entrenched, and what was lost when the priorities changed after 18. In this, you will also see that there's a lot of focus on what is middle-tier bureaucracy. So everyone focuses, usually the work that we have seen in bureaucracy is usually at the top. So, but here we are looking really at the district level of bureaucracy as well. Ehtisham Saab was one of our interviews because he was deputy commissioner over the period when this reform was being done. So we look at, because DCO was heading the education district authority for a fair bit of period, and then the bureaucracy going down to the AEO, below which is obviously the head teacher. And as I said, for this middle tier, what were the incentives? What changed in the incentives? What was the motivation? What changed? Did SOPs change? Because that, as you've seen from work from Iyer and others as well, if the SOPs don't change, then bureaucracies tend to revert back to what they were doing or what is on paper. Matthew Hull, for example, has a very nice book on CDA here in Islamabad, government by paper or government of paper. I think now we should have a new book called Government by WhatsApp, but anyway, that's a different issue. So what has survived in that? And then the tension between autonomy and control. Autonomy, we want to give autonomy to the middle tier and to head teachers and teachers, But we have this reform, as Nilofer pointed out, has a very strong monitoring and accountability element to it, and control element. You also know that this is the period in Punjab over which we had the MEA system in place, and these retired subedars, etc., were going into schools to do a monthly or fortnightly check as well. So that tension between monitoring as control and monitoring needed to, of course, for delivery. So without further ado, I'll first request Rabia Malik to present some of the findings from the qual study, and then we'll have a recorded video from Saad, who will present his quant side, and then we'll open up for discussion. Rabia, over to you.
Hello.
We can hear you. Go ahead, Rabia.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much for the opportunity to bring these findings to you. This is actually the first time that we're presenting the findings of the study to a wider audience in Pakistan. So taking cue from what Nilofer presented and what Dr. Bari spoke about, really we're going to be talking about a reform that is one of many that is introduced around the world. We're going to be talking about the specifics, details of what was introduced in Punjab, and deliberate a little bit on what we found, what worked about it, and perhaps what the challenges were. And the two aspects, just for you to keep in mind about the reform, we'll talk the two aspects to keep in mind are practices of data-driven monitoring, as well as high-stakes accountability, which is combined with top-down political ownership. So as mentioned, I'm going to present findings from the qualitative component of the Pakistan case study of the education roadmap, which was introduced in Punjab in 2012. This wasn't the only sector where Punjab introduced the reform. It was introduced in the health sector as well. The stakeholders that brought this reform, not just to Pakistan, but also to Punjab and other provinces, included political leadership at the federal level, at the provincial level, also included very closely bureaucratic leadership at the provincial level, donors and other development partners. Downstream, exactly as Barisab mentioned, we're interested in and feature quite heavily the bureaucracy at the district level. This was the tier of bureaucracy that really implemented the reform, was involved in the implementation of the reform. So we're interested, and we bring out through the qualitative study their voices of participating in a reform that's introduced with the intent to improve service delivery. How did it go? What changed for them? And what do we learn from their experiences? So the Pakistan case study, which I'm going to be talking about right now, focuses on the education sector. Just to draw a scope of what we're going to be talking about today and what the qualitative study did, we collected a lot of information about the type of delivery approach. So what were the specific goals? What were the priorities? What were the design, the design team, what was the theory of change that they were thinking about? Who introduced this, for whom, and why? We also document quite carefully at various levels, at various tiers of education service delivery, what changed in terms of management routines and practices. We also, as I mentioned, bring to you perceptions, attitudes, and any behaviors that may have changed at the provincial and district level. So this is just a stylized, very simplified diagram of what the education service delivery chain might look like. So at the top, the Chief Minister's office, the delivery unit that was set up in Punjab, which was called the Special Monitoring Unit, a host of key actors present at the provincial level. But the ones that we focus on in particular are the ones that are what we call in the study the executive district administrators. And by this, I really mean the DCOs and the DCs. We also talk to the chief education officers, and below them, them at the tehsil levels. We talked to the deputy district education officers, as well as the assistant education officers. And the reason we went to different levels, the reason we spoke to people at the federal and provincial level, but also at the district and sub-district level, is we were interested in tracing the cascade. So if you're introducing this reform at the provincial level, and I'll just talk about how it was designed, but it's being implemented at the district and sub-district level, it's important to speak to all the actors to really understand how the implementation of reform happened and how service delivery may or may not have changed. So we draw our findings from about 23 interviews with DCs and DCOs in 12 districts, and about 40, close to 40 interviews with education department officials in 5 districts. So to begin presenting the findings, what we find is that the delivery approach that was introduced in Punjab was designed and operationalized at the provincial capital. And by that I mean the delivery unit that was set up was working very closely and housed within the Chief Minister's office. It worked very closely with the education department. The role of the project management implementation unit was very important because data was very important to the delivery approach. Priorities that were identified and targets and indicators that were set was done at this level as well, and DCOs and DCs were summoned to attend progress review committee meetings, and at the provincial level these meetings were called the stocktake meetings. The reform may have been operationalized at the provincial level, but it acted on the districts, which was to say that targets were received by the DCs and the DCOs. There were data packs that were also received, and district positioning and ranking on various indicators was part of this information package. There were a series of meetings that began to be convened in order to prepare for the stock takes as well, and these were called the district review committee meetings. A step before that, the pre-DRC meetings were also convened. And one other element of the reform was that the executives of the well-performing districts were rewarded, and those of the poor-performing districts were sanctioned. So this is really a simplified version of some key aspects of this reform. But there are 2 other things that require mention, which is to say, if we think about sort of the framework or the theory that the delivery approach was operating with, was that you had to really leverage the authority of the provincial political leadership to create ownership of a reform throughout the ranks of the bureaucracy, throughout the service delivery chain, and to really catalyze large-scale movement or improvement in a number of indicators in a very short period of time. And this political oversight model, which was something that Javed Malik shared with us when we spoke with him, this political oversight model, in the way that we've learned from our various interviews, it was a very centralized political oversight model. So really the top political leadership at the province was backing this, was signaling that this was a very important reform. And academically, this is contrary, say, to or different from the role of politics in other service delivery models, which view local politics as somehow being part of accountability-based reforms. Another design element that was quite important was the data regime. So the use of disaggregated data, which Punjab was collecting, but to use it to make visible locations and areas and schools that were lagging behind. So to use data very actively to monitor progress was a practice that was introduced. The priorities were broad and process-oriented, so the approach sought to set up this practice of data-driven monitoring. It sought to improve teacher support indicators, as well as expansion of private sector schools. And now to talk a little bit about, in detail, a couple of practices. So one of the things that the delivery approach introduced in Punjab was target setting. So while Punjab has always had a history of target setting, a lot of these provinces have with the education sector plans that are published, this approach introduced some significant changes in routines and practice. So the targets that were now set in terms of what some progress, in contrast to, say, education sector plans that are sometimes for 3 years, sometimes 5 years, right? Then another thing that the approach introduced, we learned from our interviews, is that this review of targets was made a very routine practice. So the stocktake meetings that we're talking about, as well as the DRC and the pre-DRC meetings that we're talking about, centralized this practice of target setting and also monitoring progress towards achieving targets within the Punjab delivery chain or the education delivery chain. This was also disaggregated by district, so suddenly the district executives could now see what was happening within their district, but also how their district compared with other districts, which was a new practice. And finally, the DC and the DCO, even though they're responsible or were responsible at the time for nearly 11 service delivery functions, they were made responsible for reporting on the progress on targets for education. So suddenly, education was receiving quite a lot of attention in terms of relative to other service delivery functions at the district level. The first generation of targets focused on very foundational aspects such as enrollment and infrastructure. Over time, this evolved to more process-level indicators such as teacher attendance and student attendance, and there was some progress in the final years to thinking about how learning could be made a target. And one challenge was that Punjab needed to start generating data on learning, and some experiments were done for that as well. But there was very little time left, I think, before the approach ceased. For there to be real progress seen on how learning indicators worked as part of, as featuring as part of one of the indicators for the delivery approach. So one of our findings is that target setting was very much a top-down process, and it was incremental with regards to the initial position of the district, and this was fine. Most education departments actually found this to be completely fine, and the targets cascaded down from the district to the sub-district level. But there was some forced simplification of a complex context. So while there was considerable variation amongst different districts with regards to their development and geopolitical challenges, the context and context mattered, targets were sort of similar. Also, we find from some interviews that targets overlooked a very complex system. So while there were understaffed schools, and understaffed schools were, spread across the province, even single teacher schools, if one teacher was absent that day, would show up then as schools that were closed when monitoring was happening. So there was some simplification of a context when initially data started getting reported, but eventually there was a recognition that there was a system-wide problem. And I think one of the things that the practice of target setting allowed to happen was a conversation both at the district as well as provincial level that allowed system level aspects to get addressed. To what extent all system level aspects were addressed successfully remains a question and a bit outside the scope of this study. But for example, when DC started reporting on the fact that they had severely understaffed single teacher schools, there was a recognition higher up that more teachers needed to be hired. So the system did respond then by bringing in new teachers. So one of the key features of the delivery approach was the accountability mechanism that was introduced. And I haven't gone into the theory of change of delivery approaches globally, but this top-down accountability, which is very publicly sort of carried out, is a feature across many delivery approaches. And the accountability mechanism in Punjab really, we find, worked through 3 channels. And the first channel was the accountability to the Chief Minister himself, and him really chairing the stocktake meetings, reviewing the targets, making a lot of time for these meetings, and signaling that these meetings were routine, sort of 2 months after every 2-month period. And he did this over a number of years. Another channel that we've identified, which was quite interesting, is that many of the district commissioners report to us that there was a sense of competition also between peers. So between district commissioners, they wanted to do well. They wanted their districts to do well in terms of what they were reporting about progress on targets. Then, of course, there was the bonuses for good performance and transfers for poor performance. But the stocktake meetings really were the main channel of accountability. I don't think anything changed in the official ACRs. I don't think anything changed in the official sort of management contracts between the bureaucracy, the district level bureaucracy and the state. But it was really through these channels, some of which were semi-formalized and others were informal, that this accountability mechanism was playing out. And really all the other practices, be it of priority setting, be it of target setting, be it of use of data for monitoring, all of them were sort of feeding into this accountability scheme that was set up. One of our key findings, though, is about how the accountability mechanisms cascaded. So while at the provincial, from the provincial level, the design acted on the district level, and it was the district commissioners that were really accountable about the progress that various districts were making on targets, the way that cascaded to the sub-district level remained somewhat incomplete. So while some of the practices cascaded. So, for example, the meetings that were set up and the high stakes accountability was happening at all levels, at all tiers of delivery. But the rewards, for example, were not being given out at all levels, and it was really the DCs
Rabia,
that were receiving the rewards mostly, but the teams that they were working with, a lot of them were not.
Rabia, can you hear me? Could I request you to, if possible, move towards concluding?
I can. So let me just jump then to talking about the fact that the practices themselves were perceived to be quite good. But thinking about what happens in the cascade is an important point for design of delivery approaches. So while high stakes top-down accountabilities can introduce considerable activity through compliance and through the different practices, whether these practices sustain will depend on how much ownership is created at the lower levels of delivery. And if the design of the delivery approach is not thinking about the ways in which bureaucrats sitting at many different tiers of service delivery are interacting with this reform, then chances are you'll see what happened in Punjab, which is to say a lot of practices have not sustained over time. So as soon as the political ownership sort of receded, we see very little evidence that either data for monitoring in this way or some of these regular gatherings to look at practices did not happen. So ideally what you want is for a delivery approach to get introduced for a short period of time, for it to become infused through the system, no longer needing a central figure, and then for the many different actors that make up the delivery chain to take many of these practices forward. We see little evidence in our qualitative study, in this retrospective study, of that happening. I'll stop there. Happy to discuss more during.
Rabia, thank you very much, but please, I hope you'll stay around for the question period. Right?
I will do.
Yes, thank you. Could I request the playing of the video for Saad Gulzar? So now this is the quant part of the study, which is focused on a narrow question of what tagging districts as, or sub-district as red, amber or green, what did that do or not do to delivery?
present some joint work with Mohammad Zia Mahmood, Daniel Roger, and Juan Felipe Ladino. In this paper, we make use of the fact that information is increasingly available for public sector management across the world. So what we ask is if specifically centralized delivery units can capitalize on this information to deliver better public sector outcomes. We study these questions in the context of a delivery unit that was set up in Pakistan's Punjab province, which undertook high-frequency monitoring of schools, and it highlighted certain facilities, certain districts in red whenever they were poorly performing. And then these results were discussed in quarterly meetings with the chief minister, and then also monthly meetings at the district level. The idea was that, using this information, specific points of interest could be highlighted, which required more follow-up, and by doing so, these effects would cascade down the hierarchical chain and lead to changes in specific outcomes in education. Now, monitoring requires at least two key components to be successful. First, you need these high-frequency, highly disaggregated data coming from the specific units that you want to hold to account. But you also need to have a capacity to infer an appropriate counterfactual. What would have happened had these facilities not been performing poorly on the specific metric? So we need these kinds of thought experiments to be able to understand exactly what the impacts of these kind of centralized accountability mechanisms might be, and this is exactly what we're going to do in this paper. So what we do is we collect information at the school level from around 2011 to 2018 in the context of Punjab. So these include more than 50,000 plus public schools across all districts of Punjab and across all Marakis, which are units of accountability within the education, public sector education management in Punjab. Now, data from these schools were being collected independently, and these data were aggregated into these reports that the district managers and also the chief minister would see. Specifically, poor performing schools or district level officers were highlighted in red if their performance was below a certain threshold on the specific outcome that the managers were interested in thinking about. So these data were then fed into, as I said earlier, monthly district review committees. The idea was that at the district level, they would take stock of which facilities and which areas were poorly performing. And then they would meet, district managers would meet the chief minister in quarterly stock takes. And the idea there was that the chief minister would then hold these managers to account for how performance was happening within their own areas. The focus of these meetings was accountability, but also sanctions, with some potential for rewards for good performers, but a lot of sticks for bad performers. Of course, the key message here is that these are high-stake meetings, and these are interactions that are driven by accountability. So this is why we think this is a good case to think about how centralized information processing and accountability can have impact for public sector performance. So what do we do in terms of the methods in this paper? We study, or we ask if schools if a school is in a flagged markers, does the performance of that school improve relative to schools that are in a non-flagged markers? So we begin with an analysis at the markers level, and then later on I'm also going to present to you a similar analysis at the district level. What we do is we use a difference in differences framework, which again, the idea here is to establish a relevant counterfactual. What would have happened to the school had it not been in a flagged markers? So, thinking about it over time. So before that would be the before after getting flagged in red. And you can also kind of construct another counterfactual, which is you can think about schools that are in a flagged markers versus schools that are in a non-flagged markers. So the treatment here is getting flagged. It's time varying in the sense that a school can get flagged at a particular point in time, and this allows us to construct a counterfactual both in terms of time, which is the before after flagging, and also in terms of the space, physical space, which is whether you are in a flagged markers or whether you're not in a flagged markers. In the paper, we talk about many technical aspects of it. We use the latest methods such as a stack difference and differences design to deal with some problems that exist in a more traditional difference and differences framework. Okay, there are of course problems with direct observation. Spending a lot of careful energy on constructing an appropriate counterfactual is extremely important. Why is it important? Well, let's think about it for a second. What would have happened if we failed to account for threats to identification in terms of constructing an appropriate counterfactual? Well, observational data will present movement in school level outcomes as an artifact of recovery from existing shocks. So the idea here is that you get flagged if you perform poorly in a specific period. If you only compare what happens to you after you get flagged, you automatically will be going back towards the mean. So that problem is called reversion to the mean. So simply watching a response to a flag without corrections might generate the wrong conclusions. You might think that, oh, just because I have moved up from the period at which I was flagged doesn't necessarily mean that my performance has improved. It might simply be an artifact of me reverting to the mean. What if you observe just the immediate return of school outcomes to pre-shock level after the flag? How might we interpret that? Well, we might posit a positive effect of flagging, as I just said, but we are ignoring that a negative shock has led to the flagging in the first place. So what you also need is an examination of what was happening before the flagging period, because it could be the case, as I said, that the positive effect might be a reversion to the mean. And in fact, if you look at the data and you only study the effect of getting flagged, in this table, we see effects on teacher presence, student attendance, and functional facilities, the three key main outcomes. And we'll also show you outcomes on student learning, which is on math, English, and Urdu. Basically, across all of these, if you take this naive approach of only comparing places that become flagged and then comparing their outcomes in a subsequent period, you see these big improvements both in test scores, but also in presence and functional facilities. Of course, as I said earlier, this is a bad conclusion to reach because you don't know what was happening before the period of flagging, and that's going to be sort of the key point that I'm going to make in this paper. So what we find is that after you account for these kinds of problems, you're going to find broadly null effects of flagging outcomes, and I'm going to show you that in a second. In places where you do find some significant effects, they're going to be very small in magnitude, and we'll see some persistence in recovery from a negative shock. So this figure basically presents to you the main results of the study across the 6 outcomes of interest: teacher presence, student attendance, functional facilities, and then test scores from math, English, and Urdu. So here's how to read this coefficient. We're going to be focusing on 2 samples. First, we call what we call full sample, which includes all schools in the database. And then there is what we call a threshold sample, which includes schools that are, or in a later case, areas that are going to be barely missing on getting flagged. So the idea here is you're comparing places that barely got flagged versus places that barely missed on getting flagged. And again, the idea here is that these 2 schools are more likely to be similar to each other, so comparing them makes a lot more sense. But basically, the pattern we see is very similar across both data sets. Now, what we do is we center the data set at 0, where period 0 is a period when a specific facility, let's say a school, gets flagged, or a markers gets flagged, as is the case in this analysis. And what we see is that places in blue are the full sample averages, differences between the places that get flagged and the places that don't get flagged. So you can see that the places that get flagged have this big negative shock in the period in which their outcomes are being monitored, in this case teacher presence. This is the same case for student attendance, functional facilities, etc. So the idea here is that they were trending the same way as all of the other the non-flagged places that would be non-flagged eventually, but the places that eventually get flagged have this big negative shock. And what's most important is that by the time they actually end up having these meetings at the district level, they're already on their path to recovery, and by the second month after they get flagged, they have reverted back to what was happening before the period of flagging. This pattern is followed across all 6 outcomes, and our conclusion from this is that this is a big story of reversion to the mean, where some place is getting flagged, but it's going back to what it was like right before getting flagged. So the one story that's consistent with this is that the outcomes that we are studying here, such as teacher presence, student attendance, functional facilities, and so on, are the big shocks that operate in these spaces are not some underlying structural issues, but some idiosyncratic shocks that are happening to these locations. And by the time these locations get noticed, they're already on their path to recovery. So you can see this last point from, let's say, this figure over here. You can see that by the time this punishing period occurs, they're already on their path to recovery, and in the period right after punishment, they're already back at exactly the mean. They're not better than the mean, they're not worse than the mean, they're at the mean. And this again is happening across all 6 outcomes that we look at. So what we find is that fagging has no substantive effect on school performance. We also test a whole bunch of other intermediate outcomes, such as how much effort the education department is putting into managing these schools. For example, by studying the probability of receiving a visit by a public official, we find no effect on that at all. We also find no effect on any changes in head teachers. So there are no intermediate effects either, as you might imagine, because there are also no changes in the actual outcomes of interest. We repeat the same exercise with district level rankings. Again, district level rankings occurred for the meetings with the chief minister as well. And basically what we show is that there's a lot of persistence in whether the districts are ranked poorly or whether they're ranked well, and they remain somewhat similar over time. So poor districts remain poor, good districts remain good, and there's some movement, a little bit of movement, some in the middle. But the results we find for district ranking are exactly similar to the results we find for markers level flagging. And again, we find that districts that are in the poor performance buckets have some shock or none at all in most of these outcomes, and they remain as they were before. So at the district level, we see no movements at all in any of the outcomes. We also have a bunch of other results. For example, we show that flagging does not correlate with changes in student budget measures. Flagging does not correlate with rotation of district level officers, and there's also no evidence that it is correlated with the path of employment of district officers over time. All of these results are in the paper, and I encourage you to take a closer look if you're interested in the manuscript. So in the final part of the paper, we ask, how could have frontline managers spent their time in other ways, or how could have the monitoring efforts been spent in other ways? And the way we do this is we try to ask if school outcomes can be improved by thinking a little bit about the role of head teachers, who we think of are these frontline managers, school level managers who really can make a difference in terms of outcomes for school. So what we do is we quantify the quality of a head teacher using the latest techniques as reported in Phoenicia 2022, which is published in Econometrica. And we basically show that relative to a period of time when a head teacher is changed, which occurs in period 0 on the x-axis over here, you can actually see big changes in school level outcomes, both across all levels, across all 6 of our outcomes, including teacher presence, student attendance, functional facilities, and also some results on math and Urdu, but no results on English. Basically, what this is showing is that when a school moves from a poor head teacher to a good head teacher, there can be big improvements. Now, why are we showing this? Well, we're showing this because a similar kind of analysis could have been done with the same data that were collected by the monitoring regime. But instead of focusing on outcomes which had these idiosyncratic shocks, they could have focused on outcomes such as identifying good quality head teachers and placing them to schools most in need. And that would have resulted in bigger gains in terms of education outcomes than what we saw with outcomes that have these idiosyncratic shocks. So to conclude, what we try to argue is that centralized accountability infrastructure did not have substantive impacts in the case of Punjab during the period that we study. There were no impacts on budgets, inputs, outcomes, or careers. The patterns of response that we see in the data are far closer to a story of reversion to the mean, where there was some idiosyncratic shock, and things moved back to the mean by the time the data were reported and considered in meetings. So is this a story of motion without movement? Well, the question is, how could the motion have been galvanized for changes in outcomes through some other means? Well, we say that centralized data collection has powerful features such as identifying relative talent of frontline managers, in this case head teachers, as I just showed you. With an appropriate analytics team at the PMIU, they could have understood the null effects of the scheme within the first few months, and instead used the amazing data infrastructure that they had put in place to identify talented teachers and allocated them to schools that needed those specific talents. The big point we want to make is that, big data is really powerful, but unlocking its advantages requires some careful thought in terms of design, the analysis, and a willingness to experiment. Perhaps the program ran for very long, and the energies could have been used to make changes, make greater changes through a more powerful analytics team. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Right. Well, so these were the two studies that we did, the Qual 1, Quant 1. One phrase that will stick in your mind is, what was this, motion without movement. There is quite a bit of evidence that we found for that. In terms also of practices not sticking beyond a certain time, a lot of reversion to the mean in terms of both SOPs practices and also in terms of some of the outcomes. It's not the case that there weren't, so be careful in interpreting what Saad is saying. Saad is not saying, Saad and Dan, okay, there were no secular changes or there were no trend changes in provision of infrastructure, in the provision over that same period in teacher attendance or student attendance, etc. He is very carefully saying that it wasn't, if there were those changes, those weren't the result of flagging. Flagging is a very particular thing that was very, very, very specific to that particular reform. Obviously, if you see the data over that time period, you do see changes on trend in a number of those variables, but that's a different argument than the one that Dan presented. Let me now go to the panel, start with them, get some reactions to these studies, and also have a more general input on broader than the study itself. Bela, if I may start with you. You have obviously seen the reform process up close, while the reforms were going on, and also have been looking at this research as well. What are some of the lessons that you would draw out of these as we move forward to thinking about, if we are going to do delivery changes in education, how are new programs going to be designed as we move forward?
So, as the Commissioner of the Education Commission and also the co-chair of the Deliver-Ed program, as you know, it was a very big program, that investment was made. And as Nilofer said, कि ये जो delivery units बने दुनिया में, ये सिर्फ पाकिस्तान में नहीं बने या घाना में नहीं बने, but कोई 150 delivery units 80 मुल्कों में बने. तो as a change management practice, it seems that it is, generally speaking, it's a favored practice. Why? Because it gives a huge amount of visibility to politicians and also to partners who come into play with politicians. ये जो सारा aspect है जिस पे हम सुबह से बात करते रहे हैं on the delivery approaches, but also the political economy of education. बार बार ये लफ्ज़ इस्तेमाल हम करते रहते हैं. मुझे लगता है हम लोगों ने उसको समझना बहुत ज़रूरी है. हम बार बार सुबह ही से हम कह रहे हैं, सुबह से मैं भी कह रही हूँ, फाउंडेशनल लर्निंग करनी है तो हमें पार्लियामेंटेरियंस भी चाहिए, हमें सिविल सर्वेंट्स भी चाहिए, हमें कोलिशंस चाहिए. But obviously they come with their own, this kind of high profile work comes with its own tag, and it has pluses and minuses. On the one hand, you want to get the political attention, जिसको हम अक्सर हमारे यहाँ बहुत सारे DOs भी बैठे हैं, teachers भी बैठे हैं, हम कहते हैं political will होनी चाहिए, मगर दूसरी तरफ हमें bureaucratic will भी चाहिए. So this sort of delivery approach actually, and these delivery units do manage to combine the two in an ideal scenario, you know. And because of the fact that if you're taking the case of Punjab, we look at, मैं तारीख की student हूँ. So historically speaking, we heard in the morning that what happened when Shanaz Wazir Ali was being introduced, that she was actually a part of that movement that took place, I think for a good 24 months, with Michael Barber going around on the framing of the education emergency. Education emergency आ गई. अच्छा, emergency के इतना शोर मचा हुआ था कि उसके बाद this sort of delivery unit becomes very attractive. Why? In this case, इस chronology को देखें तो Michael Barber himself was a part of a delivery unit in the UK. And obviously with Tony Blair and so on, that was his story. कि उन्होंने कहा education, education, education चाहिए. हमारे यहाँ भी शहबाज शरीफ ने कहा कि हम मेरी 3 तरजीहात हैं. Actually सब chief ministers ने कहा education, education, education. But इसकी जो एक so there is this whole aspect of the positives and the negatives and the challenges of a high profile attention to education issues, but then उसके बीच में हम लोग क्या देखते हैं कि कैसे transact होता है. The retrospective study that you've seen, and you've looked at it, and so many of you were, Faisal, you were a part of it. Javed was a part, so many of you people were a part of it. मतलब एक बड़ा show था. I mean, दरबार लगता था. Stock taking होती थी. DCO ये भी थे. भावलपुर के उधर भी होती थी stock taking. I mean, it's a big thing in a way. And if you look at, we began to see another big story, and it wasn't the challenge. I think that was a positive point. Big data coming into play. We never had, I mean, although there was an emergence of big data routines, but this was big, strong data routine, and all districts. किसी ने कहा 13 districts में नहीं काम करना. It was all 36 districts. So this has its positives, but as we just saw that piece, what are we tracking? What are we tracking? Is that the most important part? हम बड़ा data देखते हैं. पता नहीं फौजिया बैठी है, हमने सिंध में भी देखा कि M&E हो रहा है, big data हो रहा है, लोग इकट्ठे बैठ रहे हैं, सूबे में इकट्ठे हो रहे हैं, you know, in the provincial headquarter, and you know, obviously उसके pressures भी बढ़े हैं. DCO को मिलते थे ना 3 times bonus. तो पूछा किसी ने DCO क्यों दिया? If a head teacher improved things, the head teacher never got anything. So when you're doing big data and you are doing accountability, that's a big lesson. You're doing it for accountability and for movement, but who are you incentivizing at the end? नीचे जो पिसे हुए DOs हैं और COs हैं और जो teachers हैं और जो field officers हैं, उनको तो कुछ नहीं मिला. So why the hell should they do it? And then, as it happens, if you're collecting your data at a time when somebody happens to be absent or something has happened or whatever, again as what Saad was saying, then you're just seeing data go like this, but nothing really, people just, because things have not systemically changed and you haven't incentivized the system as it were, then you begin to see the same kind of things. So these kind of units are extremely important for political sponsorship, because we keep on saying that. मैं आपको दोहरा रही हूँ, political will चाहिए, well then the sponsorship is there. But how are you using that political sponsorship? Acha, and then are you using it with your own money or are you using it with the donors' money? If Malaysia has been successful in this, it is because they have their own equity in it. This morning I was saying, let's do a foundation learning like with a delivery approach. But if you want to do that with the delivery approach, then it has to be your equity first and not borrowed equity. You know, वरना under invoicing over invoicing होती है. और आखिरी चीज जो मैं कहना चाह रही थी कि ये जो aspect है problem solving routines का, वो बहुत important है. We take an issue, we come together in a huddle and we try and address this. And I keep on talking कि NCOC का जो role था during COVID time was a great story of a delivery, but it happened and it went away. Or you know, so what can we learn from things like this so that हम आगे करें? I just want to end by saying कि हमने Transforming Education Summit थोड़े दिन पहले हुई बार बार उन्होंने कहा लर्निंग का चैलेंज है, टीचर्स का चैलेंज है और टीचर्स सपोर्ट का चैलेंज है। आपको इनोवेशंस और डेटा को आप लोग सामने लेकर आइए और आप फाइनेंसिंग करें। जब तक हमारे पास एक इकोसिस्टम नहीं बनता ट्रांसफॉर्मेशंस का, उस वक्त तक इस तरह की just delivery approaches by parachute do not work. Not that this was delivery approach by parachute, but I think it has given us tons of lessons that if we had to do it again, how would we do it differently?
Shukriya Bela. Sham Sahab, you were a DCO at the time, and so your experiences of course would be very valuable. Aapne dono studies suni. What would be some reactions that you would have if you reflect back on the practice?
Dr. Bari, I'm aware that you are short of time और हमें दिखाया जा रहा है कि 10 minutes रह गए हैं, तो I'll try to be brief. अगरचे बहुत बात की जा सकती है. I'm the person who was in the midst of the system, so I have first-hand experiences of many other things. Before identifying areas of improvement, let me make an admission first. This was the first ever time in the history of Pakistan that so much political leadership, ownership was being extended to anything related to education sector. No chief executive of province had given so much time and attention to education before or since. So now that we are sitting here and trying to, identify the bottlenecks and finding faults with the whole system, it was first time that somebody was taking it so seriously. Yeah. When we come to learning lessons, the biggest fault which I identify today in the hindsight is that everything was kind of one-way traffic flow. We were being told to do this, we were being told to do that, but we were not taken into confidence while designing the entire plan or while implementing it. So we were in a way acting as tools only who used to get directions from this delivery unit and who would try to implement it as such because of two things. Firstly, it is by design, the district administrations function this way. When they get some instruction, they would, without going into the merits of that thing, they would try to get it implemented in letter and spirit. Secondly, we were avoiding naming and shaming. We have been listening that in those days, heat maps were generated, stock takes used to take place, and the district rankings, so traffic lights and so many jargons came up in those days. So every deputy commissioner would, not for the love of education, but for the fear of being named and shamed, would try to implement those agendas. So what we could do was we could create a movement where all of us could have been taken on board. We could see our input being taken, and then we could have become a better part of this organization, implementation machinery. The biggest missing link was the teachers, as Bela has also pointed out. They were teachers and their administrators, the DOs, the deputy DOs, AEOs, the COs, all of them. They were just seen as tools of implementation. No input was taken at the time of design of the project. No feedback loop was created. So for them, there was an environment of fear and pressure. All the time, the MES, and those were, as you know, those were subedars. Army के subedar आते थे, उन्होंने पकड़े हुए होते थे, tablets होते थे, और वो आके हमारे स्कूलों में टक 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 कर रहे होते थे. स्कूल के टीचर खड़े किए हुए होते थे और उनसे सवाल करके उसके अंदर फीड करते थे. खैर हमारे टीचर भी बड़े तेज हैं, उन्होंने जल्दी भांप लिया कि ये किस क्लास से कौन से सवाल करते हैं, उन्होंने बाकी चीजें छोड़ देनी, वो सवाल तैयार करा के रखने. तो what was being done, अच्छा incentives भी उन टीचर्स के लिए तो नहीं थे, अगर कोई इंसेंटिव थे भी तो वो ऊपर ही जा रहे थे. तो हो ये रहा था, आई वुड से कि एक टूल ले लेते हैं टीचर्स अटेंडेंस, वो तो इम्प्रूव कर गई, लेकिन टीचर की क्वालिटी ऑफ टीचिंग किसने असेस की. हो ये रहा था जिसको आज मैं कह रहा हूँ कि they were taking horse to the well, but they couldn't make it drink. तो जो learning outcomes थे वो unfortunately उस तरह improve नहीं हुए जैसे होने चाहिए थे. कोई बात नहीं, ताली बजा लें, जाग जाएंगे आप लोग.
Thank you very much. So Navisa, if I may, आप governance देखते हैं. Your reflection back on this particular reform and the lessons that we can learn from it in designing the future reforms.
Thank you, Dr. Saab. I'm really glad कि आपने मुझे जावेद से पहले बोलने का मौका दिया, क्योंकि मैंने बहुत सारे पॉइंट्स उन्हें बता दिए हैं जो कि वो बोलेंगे, तो इसलिए I was keen कि मैं पहले इनसे बोल लूँ. So as you mentioned, my take is slightly different from a governance point of view, and I've been lucky to be involved in some of these approaches which were introduced in Punjab in varied forms in KP and at the federal level also in different sectors. So if I can try to take a macro picture and macro approach, although I'm not at all an expert or certainly not an academic, this would be a practitioner's view, as Commissioner Saab was also reflecting on some of those happenings in the past. So I think we tend to over-criticize any new reform that is introduced. So like so many other reforms, this was an approach that was taken and is still being played out and still being implemented in different sectors and at different levels of government. So my counter question is always, if this is not working, what else is working? So we have to compare reform with other reforms that are being implemented. And of course, the questions of sustainability, ownership, resourcing are always there in all kinds of reform initiatives. No reform is perfect, and neither is this one. So we have to take that with a big caveat, take any reform with such caveats that no reform is perfect. So having said that, so I think some of the things which have stayed, and I'm slightly, I would not say disappointed, but I would suggest that if researchers can also look at the education bureaucracy itself. We have heard deputy commissioners and DCs a lot of times, yeah, but what happened inside the secretariat itself, because there was a big role that secretary, additional secretary, and directorates underneath them also played. So has anything changed there? And there's a difference between rules and routines. Bureaucracy of all over the world thrives on these things, or does not in some cases. So has there been any changes in the regulatory or legal framework as a result of this intervention? Routines, we have heard a lot of times. There were established routines. Some of them have stayed. Majority, I think, have not. So that lesson is quite clear. But what has changed in the regulatory and legal framework? And I think this reform cannot be seen in isolation from other reforms that are needed, most importantly, civil service reform itself. Starting from not one sector, but across the sectors. So if the incentives are not right for civil servants, whether it's education, health, revenue mobilization, as the researcher was saying, things would revert back to mean. So I think we need to give more time to Javed Malik Saab.
2 minutes हैं सर जी खूब करे हमसे थोड़ा सा गिला भी सुन लें ये तो शाम साहब बड़ी ज़िंदगी मुश्किल है जाहिर है इस पे कोई कंप्लेंट हमें नहीं होनी चाहिए I think look, the key question we had in 2009 was that how to mobilize political will and sustain it for something which was neglected for the last 60 years. We mobilized the political will of the Chief Minister, who was focused only on fixing Danish schools. We made him to deliver 54,000 schools, and during that period of time, we doubled the budget. We hired 100,000 teachers. We kind of brought back 1 million more children reading and writing every day. They used to be absent. We improved the facilities of 45,000 schools. And when we started, and I was in that meeting when we decided that we would be, DFID would be investing £68 million in Punjab Education Foundation. And through the roadmap, when we started, it used to have 400,000 children. And now when we left, it's now having collectively, PIMA and PEF collectively have 3.2 million children. Once we left from the sector since 2008, not a single teacher is hired, not a single teacher. Today, the sector in Punjab is shortage of 115,000 teachers, the 85,000 multi-grade teaching. When the state wasn't even doing the basic functions, this roadmap approach was able to make the sector deliver and work on multiple levels. I found actually Saad slightly intellectually innocent, really. By looking at only one bit of the data and concluding something, I actually think that this control trial system, I think, is not really taking the subset of the thing and then generalizing it for the system. Whereas the episteme and ontology and episteme for looking at the public sector reform is more of a critical realism. You have to look at the variety of sources to look at the change process and look at how the entire machinery works. I mean, the point is, and I know that I've just had 30 seconds, the point is that we were trying to fix the post-colonial bureaucracy of 60 years through a political mandate of the chief minister, valid political mandate of the chief minister, and international aid bailout was just 3% of the total thing. It wasn't a donor-driven thing. We tried to do with other chief ministers, and I worked later on after DFID, worked with the political leaders in human rights, with parliamentary committees when I was the director of Democracy Reporting International. Political will works in very different manner with very different leaders, right? And that would remain a question for public policy and public sector reform. And I think the jury is still out. I would have liked more time. And this paper I requested roughly 5 times that whether I can have access to these papers so that we could have more solid discussion on that. So I'm actually willing, from the Malala Fund, willing to kind of host another roundtable to get to the bottom of it. I think this is not the time to do it because Wasim Sir and others are here. But my final one-point request would be that Pakistan's education sector at this moment of time, when the GDP, the overall investment of the GDP for education declined from 2.3 to 1.78%, we still need political will. We still need some kind of capacity to convert political will into technical programs. We need still stock takes and data. And we need also focus on head teachers, I think, and school-level leadership to transform the system. I don't think any other theory of change is available to transform the system. Thank you very much.
बहुत बहुत माजरत आप सब से मुझे बताया गया कि कोई सवाल जवाब का टाइम रह नहीं गया, इसलिए बहुत माजरत और बहुत शुक्रिया आपके टाइम का। अगले सेशन का वक्त हो गया, इसलिए उन्होंने कहा था जी बंद कर दीजिए।
It's just that we are going over the next couple of months. We will have a dedicated 2 or 3 day event. This was because FCDO was already doing this, so we had limited time. But I think going forward, we will definitely, Javed, we will have a lot of time to discuss it. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. Can I please request everyone to have some tea and please come back. Take your tea actually, because we're starting the next session. We still have one very interesting panel left. You know, I was never a very good, even when I was a teacher. Acha, nahi, मैं भेज नहीं रही. So, ladies and gentlemen, we'll be starting our next session, the last session for today, which I'm very much looking forward to and promises to be very interesting. And that is on data, design, decisions, and politics. All that matters. In this panel, Dr. Salman Humayun will be moderating this panel, so let me just quickly introduce him. Dr. Salman Humayun is a highly accomplished public policy expert with 20 years of experience in managing, designing, and delivering technical assistance. He started his career as a faculty member at the Quaid-e-Azam University in Islamabad. Dr. Humayun joined the Research Triangle Institute in North Carolina and worked as Deputy Chief of Party of a USAID-funded education sector reforms assistance program in Pakistan. Currently, he is the Executive Director of the Institute of Social and Policy Sciences. Dr. Humayun's areas of interest include public policy, data-based planning, public finance, and governance reforms. He is also the alumni of regional and international policy think tanks like the Regional Center for Strategic Studies, Colombo, Wilton Park, United Kingdom, and the International Academy for Leadership, Germany. Thank you, Dr. Salman Humayun, for moderating this panel. In this panel, and I will let you introduce the panelists, but we're also joined by Mr. Rahmat Salam Khattak, the advisor to CM on education in KP, Mr. Wasim Ajmal, who's the additional secretary at the Federal Ministry of Education, and Mr. Ghulam Fareed, who's the former Secretary of Education from Punjab, and Ehtisham Anwar, who is now the Commissioner of Bahawalpur and very recently was the Secretary of Education in South Punjab. Over to you, Dr. Salman. Yes. Can I please invite the panelists to the...
commission against a private limited school chain, or should I go to the local education functionary and so on and so forth? So this is a question that how, as a state, as an administration, as politicians, we are responding to education as a whole, not only for the public sector. Over the last 2 days, we have largely focused on public sector education, its dysfunctionality, why it is not working, whereas we are a little less concerned about the market actors. Yes, from the equity perspective, perhaps education is very important in public sector, but this is the reality that we cannot deny. So, what is the question for the panelists? The question is it a design issue, or we shy away touching the political economy of market actors? Is it safer education for us to stay as a consultant, as a government, as a politician, as parent with private sector and try to fix the public sector? So it's a huge political economy question I would like to put on table, that we need to think of both public and private. And when we think on that, so this image really captivates me at times. So if these two streams are not mingling up, or there is no confluence of them, so how we really going there? And that takes me to in the middle of all that depressive thing, Kipling at times come to rescue. So never the twain shall meet, or we have any semblance of political will and the administrative capacities to see that how these public-private sector would come together in such a manner that it can deliver the basic promise of education, that is that education is a social equalizer. If education is not a social equalizer, we are getting back to reinforcing the existing schism in the society, and we are sharpening the fissures in the society. So that's a serious challenge, I believe. Therefore, I thought that this overarching issue of public-private should be a moot point for us in the following time and days. So once we move on, we do understand that for the market thing, governments over decades have been able to design something to respond to marginalization through subsidies and so on and so forth. So if I think in terms of addressing marginalization by state actors giving subsidies, what comes to mind? PEF, Punjab Education Foundation, in terms of fee vouchers, other foundation-assisted schools and so on. Level targeting some kind of support to those left out and marginalized areas where there should be. तो जी पंजाब में भी वो पंजाब एजुकेशन फाउंडेशन देती है, स्टाइपेंड भी देती है बच्चों को, वाउचर्स भी देती है, केपी में भी देती है, सिंध में भी देती है, वो हर जगह पे है. तो कुछ है ज़रूर कि हम सोचते हैं कि यार मार्केट एक्टर्स को इन्वॉल्व करते हैं और इनको आउटसोर्स कर देते हैं स्कूल, और ये लोग फिर तालीम देंगे और उनके रिजल्ट्स कुछ बेहतर भी हैं. लेकिन इसके साथ फिर तालीम का जो प्राइवेट सेक्टर है वो उससे काफ़ी बड़ा है. रेगुलेशंस की जब बात होगी, देयर वुड बी ह्यूज पॉलिटिकल इकॉनमी अराउंड इट अगेन. बहुत से इंटरेस्ट ग्रुप्स होंगे जो चाहेंगे कि ये रेगुलेशन ना हो, कुछ चाहेंगे हो. देयरफॉर अ मोर टेक्निकल क्वेश्चन दैट हाउ द रेगुलेशन शुड लुक लाइक. So this is about the nut and bolts of regulation. So I and Wasim sir was just having a conversation that maybe the regulation should be very lean and with a facilitative mode. Can we facilitate private sector? Can we think of some business models as a solution to the development challenge of non-performing education? Can we think in terms of providing access to credit to the low-fee schools? Can we think really in terms of impact investments and issuing bonds for the market to facilitate and then see whether they are performing in terms of learning outcomes or not? So output regulation might be a way forward where we are not concerned about their size of room, their qualifications of teachers and so on and so forth, but we are very concerned whether kids are learning or not. So we hold that criteria as a major filter to support them, facilitate them, and there's the only regulatory entry point where you can interact with the private schools. So I think for the going forward business solutions, thinking of various corporate-like situations where market is really engaged and held responsible and accountable for their delivery is one of the very important point. When it comes to subsidies, targeting is a very central question. And I and Sham was having a conversation on our way to hotel. And he came up with a very interesting phrase. He said, yeah, our subsidies are very well targeted. I said, oh, I think they are not well targeted. And Sham was of the view that they are well targeted, they target elite very well. They are politically targeted. They are not technically targeted. So subsidies are targeted, but perhaps along political lines and not along technical reasons to target. Zebra Talim is one example in case of Punjab, and my two colleagues have been serving in Punjab big time, Fareed Saab and Sham Saab. So Zebra Talim is about giving around 6 billion in the southern districts of Punjab across the board to all girls of grade 6 and 8. So what kind of subsidy it is? We can make it very effective by just linking it with socio-economic registry-based data. And this 6 billion can serve more families and households, maybe in 26 districts, than only giving subsidy across the board to every girl, whether coming from a middle class, lower middle, whatever the quintile she's coming from, we can still ensure that it is well targeted. So that is another question that we need to think. My second last point, I'm just trying to make Freya more patient by saying second last point. So district education management becomes serious concern. So whatever the policies you have, whatever good, bad or ugly data you have, whatever सियासतदान कहते हैं कि जी ये हो जाएगा और वो पार्लियामेंट में कह देते हैं ये हो जाएगा, delivery unit would remain a district. So we know that there are constraints around decentralization and all that. But on district management, there are certain numbers which I would really like to share with this august audience. मेरा ख्याल सबको पता होगा, लेकिन अगर पंजाब का एक आप टिपिकल डिस्ट्रिक्ट देखें और मैंने मुजफ्फरगढ़ पकड़ लिया, मुजफ्फरगढ़ is about 1,300 schools, 1,300 schools, around 10,000 teachers, 200,000 beneficiaries are students, and around 1 billion rupees. What kind of manager you need for this kind of management? Had it been a private sector conglomerate, what kind of manager they would put in place who is required to manage 1300 schools और 11 बिलियन या 2000 के बच्चों की enrollment के लिए अगर कोई एक प्राइवेट स्कूलों की चेन तो किस किस्म का मैनेजर ढूंढ रही होगी? I think we can all relate that very quickly. But here, in this case, we are having teachers as managers, and that's a double jeopardy for the system. We lose a teacher by making him a manager, and we get a poor manager. A manager is required to do the HR functions and better planning, targeting, ensuring learning outcomes, ensuring that something great happens within the classroom, ensuring that they play well, they go to the playground, and so on and so forth. And we think that fine, a teacher who is teaching, great, maybe Islamiyat or Pakistan studies is made a district education manager. That has serious implications for the management of the thing. And here, look at the tenures of the managers. This heat map will give you a feel that over the 4 years, there have been even 10 managers to certain districts. All those districts that are colored yellow, they had around 6 to 10 managers in 4 years, meaning thereby on average for 6 months at tenure. So ये इस तरह की reshuffling इतनी जल्दी होनी चाहिए नहीं होनी चाहिए. By the way, I don't want to get into serious politics at the moment, otherwise Mianwali is red because they got 10 managers in 4 years. So what's the tenure? And we were not satisfied with this data then. We thought we need to further zoom in on this and see that what is happening. And now the slide that I'm going to show, somebody might like to identify the person who I have tried to mask. He's not there in the slide, but I believe वो कहते हैं ना कुछ चीते बैठे हैं जो ढूंढ लेंगे कौन बंदा है. Let me show you that once we started tracking a EDO, a single EDO, and in the interest of privacy, I will not share the name. He spent 1 month in Bahawalpur, then transferred to Sialkot. He spent 5 months there, transferred to Narowal. He spent 6 months there, transferred to, again back to, I am unable to read that. Aftabad. Okay, then 4 months in another district, 1 month in another district, 7 months again in Rahim Yar Khan, and then again 7 months. So look at these numbers. These are only, ये 3.25 साल का time है total. maybe, yeah, it is. Inland management tourism. So, so issue ये है ये कितना indispensable आदमी है. What a great performer he must have been कि हमने उसको 3.5 साल में 9 डिस्ट्रिक्ट करवा दिए. उसके बगैर काम ही नहीं चलता. वो जहाँ जाता है either he is a hitman for finances or whatever. So either he's an economic hitman, so to say, in want of a better word, or he's a great manager. There are only 2 possibilities. So this is a system level issue, that how we can really manage these kind of tenures. I know why I'm putting it on the table is the reasons to understand the political constraints and the binding constraints on our staff and our teams in the field. So the idea is not to embarrass anybody. The idea is that this is a binding constraint. And we are unable to retain our education manager in a district for a decent time duration where he is able to do something great. और उसके पास जाएंगे कि मैंने फाइल निकाली थी वो फिर मैं तो चला गया वहाँ से, वो फाइल फिर वहीं पड़ी होगी, तो उसका आप क्या करेंगे? तो 9 डिस्ट्रिक्ट्स इतने अरसे में रहे तो इसको कैसे देखा जा सकता है? मेरा ख्याल है इसके गिर्द एक स्ट्रॉन्ग पॉलिटिकल इकोनॉमी है. दैट्स व्हाई इट हैपेंस. पॉलिटिशियंस, हैंडपिक्ड पीपल. वो जी जो डिस्ट्रिक्ट मैनेजर वो फिर लगाना तो हमने अपनी मर्जी का है ना, वैसे तो काम चलेगा नहीं, ना इलेक्शन होते हैं ना कोई और काम होता है, उसके लिए कुछ करना तो पड़ेगा हमें. अच्छा, इवन देयर हैव बीन डिबेट्स एंड डिस्कोर्सेस, केपी ने कर लिया वैसे काफ़ी हद तक, कि आप एक एजुकेशन मैनेजमेंट कैडर बना लें. सो इफ आई थिंक इन टर्म्स ऑफ पोलिटिकल इकोनॉमी देयर आर इश्यूज अराउंड दैट. देयर आर मेजर 3 ग्रुप्स. Politicians might not like to have an education management cadre because then manager would come from the cadre. Certain bureaucrats might resist, as it happened in the case of KP, then that if the cadre is created, the cadre would also claim to be the education secretary and the director schools and so on and so forth. So there is a problem with the cadre. And then the teachers themselves, if they once get inducted in the cadre, they cannot go back in the teaching, and if they don't perform, they are captive there. So how to navigate it, I don't know. But I think these are the debates. Javed साहब ने भी कहा ना कि मैं एक और सेमिनार फंड करता हूँ. मैं फंड तो नहीं कर सकता, लेकिन मैं विलिंग हूँ एक और सेमिनार करने के लिए. चल साढ़े तो ले लेना. And last, and I put especially this slide, assuming that Wasim Ajmal Sahab would grace the occasion, and I thought he is thickly involved in this debate about the inter-tier relations and some inconvenient conversations that we need to have. Let me really share that we are about national education, which is beyond 4 provinces, areas, and federal government. So I would really like to create categories of federal versus national, or federal and national. So here the issue as development practitioner is how we can generate a national response to the educational challenges. Yes, that would be delivered in the province anyways. So we have witnessed, Freya mujhe keh rahi hai jaldi khatam karen, so I'll just skip something about single national curriculum, then of course about minimum common standards, कि जी क्या standards हों जी. और जब हम minimum common standards की बात करते हैं तो ये data के standards भी हैं. PI is working on that, Pakistan Institute of Education, that has been recently revamped. Wasim Sahab is taking a lot of lead and giving time to PI. So minimum common standards are around data, around assessments, around curriculum, all that. That is a concern. But what is the inconvenient conversation which we normally shy away, and that we need to do as a politician of this country and as a practitioner of this country? That goes back to 18th constitutional amendment. That's a huge political economy. We would not like to touch that perhaps. That's a very, very inconvenient conversation, and we need to be mindful of that. There's a caution. But second thing is, what is the way forward? We understand that when this amendment was being designed, we thought that yes, this is a good idea to do away with concurrent list, but common standards and assessment must remain with the federal government, meaning thereby what is the wherewithal through which it can stay with them? Put it in the legislative list part 2. For my international colleagues, let me go in little detail for that for a while. Pakistan's constitution has different legislative list, and legislative list 2 is which is the jurisdiction of the Council of Common Interest. So if there is something that concerns all the provinces and the federal government, that should be within the Council of Common Interest. So maybe an inconvenient conversation need to be started there. Would we really like to bring assessment and minimum common standards to legislative list part 2? Maybe down the line 10 years, 20 years, 40 years, I don't know. But I think that conversations need to be cultivated, supported, and see that how various political parties resolve to handle this issue. And maybe we can produce a good technical brief for them that why it is really needed. Whether it happens or not is a big, big political economy question, so I will not go there. Then I will only flag, last slide, Freya. I will only flag 4 issues that are very high when it comes to technical political asymmetry. Decentralization of education delivery. I know it is a tough political economy. We can't touch that. Even Supreme Court's injunction cannot touch that. But we have been able to design something around that. That is what we call the school-based budgeting, non-salary budgets. So at least that is one way of giving some money back to the schools so that they are little autonomous and can play with that and see what they want to achieve with that. Vacant teaching posts. Punjab still has around 80,000 vacant vacancies at the moment. So they are approved positions but still vacant. So how we go about that? Why they are not being recruited? Certain procedural snags, once somebody retires, then it goes for the advertisement, public service commission, and so on and so forth. So vacant position to the, even in Balochistan, I was studying that RISE paper, a couple of teachers were not provided to the newly constructed school. So SNEs are there, schedule of new expenditures are there, approved seats but not recruited. So what kind of political economy is there? Perhaps we will never be able to understand better than those guys who are on the other side of the table, and they can inform us, guide us on that. Multigrade teaching is a serious issue. Earlier there were multigrade teacher training, multigrade assessment materials, multigrade reading materials and assessments. But that all 3 things were thrown out of window because government thought that they will be providing 1 room, 1 teacher to every student, at least in case of 1 province. So we did away with that. But later on it didn't happen, and we are moving on with that multigrade. So that's a difficult issue जो हमें देखना पड़ेगा. And then of course rationalization of teacher. We all been talking about that. There are schools with oversupply of teachers, and there are schools with undersupply of teachers. But doing that rationalization on the technical side is a very simple thing. You give data to anybody in this room, they'll rationalize the teachers school-wise and enrollment-wise. But how to implement that's a huge challenge, and how to navigate all that. Thank you very much. जी सीम साहब को सबसे आखिर में लेना चाहूँगा, उससे पहले इचाम साहब, over to you, then फरीद साहब, मिनिस्टर साहब आपको हम आखिर में लेते हैं. I'm the moderator.
Not very moderate, but you. सर एक तो आपने सबसे जूनियर से आगाज़ किया है, ऊपर से आपने माशाल्लाह इतना कम्प्रिहेंसिव इंट्रोडक्शन दिया है कि शायद अब इसमें एडिशन मेरे जैसे कम पढ़े लिखे फ़र्द के लिए इस फील्ड में मुमकिन नहीं रही. स्टिल कोशिश किए देखते हैं. थैंक यू सर. आई वाज लुकिंग एट द क्वेश्चन एंड it was being said that data, design, decision, and politician, what matters? सवाल कुछ इस तरह से था. I was thinking and I was trying to figure out which one is the most important of all those 4 factors. As regards data, if I take one by one, data is a double-edged weapon. Well, it is necessary for informed decision making, but it creates some sort of immunity as well at one level. You know, we have been talking about out-of-school children in Pakistan. In every conference, you'll be hearing this jargon. And Pakistan has 22.8 million out-of-school children. That is sad. Somebody would tell you, अगर एक line में out-of-school children खड़े कर दिए जाएं, तो every 9th child would be a Pakistani. Another person would tell you that 22.8 million students mean a country bigger than Sri Lanka, something closer to Australia. लेकिन अब it doesn't make any difference to us. हम सुनते हैं और एक कान से सुनते हैं, दूसरे कान से निकाल देते हैं. तो डेटा का overuse जो है, sometimes मैं इसको flag कर रहा हूँ कि it's counterproductive. Design, does it matter? The session which was held just prior to this session, we just saw that the intention was there, the funding was there, but we saw that it did not sustain the test of the times. تو ڈیزائننگ کا بھی آئی ڈونٹ تھنک دیر از اے ڈس ایگریمنٹ کہ اس کے اندر کوئی ڈیزائن کی بہتری جو ہے مطلوب ہے, از نیسسری فار سسٹینیبلٹی. Decision is the third point of discussion today. Who takes the decisions? Political bureaucracy and bureaucracy and the politician. ویسے میں political bureaucracy شاید صحیح کہہ گیا ہوں کہتے کہتے.
Good Freudian slip. Good Freudian slip.
جی. So mistakenly, اچھا controlled slip of tongue بھی کہا جا سکتا ہے. اچھا تو before we go to politicians, I would want everyone of you to look at the bureaucracy as well. Sir, آپ نے کہا کہ one CO education was being transferred in 3.5 سال, in 3.5 years to 9 different places. In our province, Punjab, more than those many numbers have been, more than that, the secretaries have been transferred in Punjab. I mean, the school ke, sir, mera khayal hai 12 secretaries to change hue honge in last 5 years or so. 15th one is serving currently Punjab in last 3-4 years. In less than 5 years. So you can well imagine ke, first of all, when the appointment of secretary is being made, the head of a department who is going to manage the most important sector of a country, uski inclination is not taken into account when he is being posted. Na uska experience dekha jata hai ki usne social sector mein kaam kiya hai, na hi uski apne kaam karne ki desire ke wo karna bhi cha raha hai. To ek secretary is being posted. Uske baad security of tenure ki baat aati hai, chale post hi kar diya, to ab kya aap usse rakh bhi rahe hain? To wo maine bhi baat kar di ki ہر 3-4 مہینے کی اوسط پہ ایک سیکٹری کو بدل دیا جاتا ہے. ہم خود بھی بیوروکریسی جو ہے بہت اتنی اس طرح کی سوشل سیکٹرز کی پوسٹنگ کے لیے کم لوگ آپ کو ملیں گے جو ولنگ ہوتے ہیں ان کو ان میں جانے کے لیے. فائنلی اگر یہ بیوروکریسی کوئی ڈیسیجن لیتی بھی ہے تو 3 اسٹیک ہولڈرز آپ دیکھ سکتے ہیں. 3 اسٹیک ہولڈرز ٹو دا ڈیسیجن میکنگ. 1, I'll club it as government. 2, I'll club it as the teachers, the administrators, the principals, headmistresses, etc. And the third stakeholders are the students, the children. But traditionally in Pakistan only one stakeholder takes all the decisions. ہم نے کبھی اپنے ٹیچرس کو کبھی بھی کسی ڈیسیجن میکنگ میں ساتھ نہیں بٹھایا, ان کا ان پٹ نہیں لیا اور پھر کوئی فیڈ بیک لوپ نہیں ان کے ساتھ ڈیولپ کیا. اور بچے تو ہو ہی نہیں سکتے نا, ہم لوگ تو مطلب یہ تو بہت ہی فینسی تھاٹ ہے کہ اگر کہا جائے کہ بچوں سے بھی پوچھیں کہ وہ کیسا پڑھنا چاہتے ہیں اور کیا اچھا لگتا ہے کیا برا لگتا ہے. میں بہت سی باتیں سر نے کر دیں, وہ میں نے ان کو چھیڑا تو وہ کاسٹ آف ریپوٹیشن پہ ہوں گی. میں 2-3 باتیں کرنا چاہوں گا جو میں نے آئیڈینٹیفائی کی اور میں دیکھتا ہوں کہ وہ ہمارے کامن پارلنس میں نہیں آ رہی ہیں, اور اس کو میں چاہوں گا کہ اس طرح کے فورم پہ لوگ سمجھ لیں, سن لیں, اور کسی نہ کسی جگہ انشاءاللہ جب ڈسکشن میں آئے گا تو کچھ بہتری نظر آئے گی. ایک تو ہے پولیٹیشین ٹیچر نیکسس, یعنی باقی نیکسس تو ہم نے دیکھے ہی ہیں, ایون ہماری پوسٹنگ ٹرانسفر میں ان کا ایک رول ہوتا ہے, لیکن یہ والا ایلیمنٹ جو ہے جہاں ایک ٹیچر, ایک ہیڈ ماسٹر, ایک ہیڈ مسٹریس اور یہ سو آن اینڈ سو فورتھ نیکسس بناتے ہیں, یہ بہت خطرناک ہو جاتا ہے. وہ کس طرح سے کہ کوئی کتنے ویل میننگ سیکرٹری, ویل میننگ گورنمنٹ کیوں نہ آ جائے, جو امپلیمنٹنگ آرم ہے وہ تو یہ سی اوز اور ٹیچرز وغیرہ نہیں ہونا ہے. لیکن ہمارے ہاں میں نے دیکھا, میں نے 4 حکومتوں کے ساتھ سیکرٹری ایجوکیشن کے طور پہ سرو کیا ہے پچھلے 3 سال میں, اب صوبے میں بدلتی رہی گورنمنٹس. ہر گورنمنٹ نے پہلا کام یہ آ کے کروایا کہ سی اوز بدلوائے. جو بھی پولیٹیشین بلانگ کرتا تھا گورنمنٹ سائڈ سے وہ فرسٹ آف آل مانگے گا کہ سی اوز بدل دے. اور جو آرگیومنٹ وہ آ کے دیتا تھا میرے لیے وہ بڑا آئی اوپنر تھا. سب آ کے کہتے تھے ذرا فلاں نو بدل دیو, تانوں تو پتہ نہیں پھر الیکشن ہوندے نے, ساڈا خیال شیال بھی دینا رکھنا ہوتا ہے. تو مجھے نہیں پتا تھا, میں کبھی ان کو اس اینگل سے نہیں دیکھتا تھا کہ ٹیچرز جو ہیں وہ ان کو اگر ہم ان رولز میں رکھتے ہیں, یہ جو الیکشن میں نے پھر میرے ساتھ چونکہ یہ کولیگس تھے, میں نے ان سے ایک دن پوچھنا شروع کیا واٹ ڈو یو ڈو ان الیکشنز, کیا آپ کا کوئی رول ہوتا ہے واقعتاً یہ جو سارے؟ تو انہوں نے کہا جی بالکل سر, ہمارا رول تو ہر سٹیج پہ موجود ہے الیکشن ڈے کے اوپر. تو وہاں مجھے پتا چلا کہ سب سے پہلے تو ہمیں اس نیکسس کو, اگر ہم رائٹ مین ایٹ دا رائٹ جاب لگانا ہے تو ہمیں اس نیکسس کو توڑنا پڑے گا. اور اس نیکسس کو کیسے توڑا جا سکتا ہے, میں یہ جو آڈینس بیٹھے ہوئے ان سے گزارش کروں گا کہ اپنی اپنی جگہ اس کو ایڈوکیٹ کیجیے گا جب بھی موقع ملا, کہ الیکشن ڈیوٹیز کے لیے पोलियो के लिए भी नहीं, बाकी चीज़ों के लिए भी नहीं टीचर्स अवेलेबल, लेकिन इलेक्शन ड्यूटी के लिए बिल्कुल बिल्कुल अवेलेबल नहीं होने चाहिए। तो इसकी कन्वर्सिंग होने की ज़रूरत है। सर लास्ट बात करना चाहूँगा, और वो ये कि आपने कहा कि कोई नेशनल रिस्पॉन्स टू एजुकेशन के मामलात में होना चाहिए। टू कोट यू, नेशनल रिस्पॉन्स टू एजुकेशनल चैलेंज। तो जी हाँ, हमने पिछले सालों में वी टॉक्ड अबाउट चार्टर ऑफ डेमोक्रेसी, फिर अभी बात हो रही है चार्टर ऑफ समथिंग इकोनॉमी, सब लोग बैठे और इकोनॉमी पे कुछ एग्री कर लें। इसी तरह चार्टर ऑफ एजुकेशन की भी बहुत ज़्यादा ज़रूरत है, वरना आपने देखा वी जस्ट सॉ इन द लास्ट सेशन के 9 years वो एक बड़ा पंजाब का एक बड़ा एक्टिव प्रोग्राम रहा, लेकिन उनके जाते वो रैप अप कर दिया गया। तो अब हमें इस बात पे भी बात करने की ज़रूरत है, और उसमें शायद आपका भी किरदार होगा, मीडिया का, सिविल सोसाइटी का, डेवलपमेंट पार्टनर्स का, कि वो कम से कम काम तो स्टार्ट करें ना, कम से कम कन्वेंसिंग तो करना शुरू करें ना, कि सारे लोगों को कहें कि आप सब लोग बैठे और 10 साल का कम से कम एक प्लान बनाए और सब लोग उस पर एग्री करें और उसको लेके चलें। सर थैंक यू।
थैंक यू डॉक्टर साहब, शुक्रिया। मैं थोड़ा सा ऑर्डर चेंज कर रहा हूँ बिकॉज आई एम कैप्टिव टू दिस पेपर। आई एम नो मोर ए मॉडरेटर। मैं मिनिस्टर साहब से रिक्वेस्ट करता हूँ अगर मिनिस्टर साहब पहले बात कर लें, क्योंकि वी नीड टू परहैप्स वाइंड अप। उन्होंने मुझे कहा।
बिस्मिल्लाहिर्रहमानिर्रहीम। अस्सलाम वालेकुम एवरीवन। A decade of learning experience and achievement in education is really a successful decade in the era of education, especially in our KP. You all know that over the past decade, Pakistan has made considerable progress in transforming its education system apart from local funding. Funding from the UK government and other development partners has been important in this transformation. The UK government invested £800 million in a decade-long 7 programs, bilateral portfolio of UK investment in Pakistan's education system. This investment directly supported approximately 5.8 million children in our province to get access to free education across the country. The UK government's investment aligned with a significant focus on an investment in education by government of Pakistan and other development partners. In this period, Pakistan has been the center of the global debate on education policy, on what works in education, from global research program to national innovation funds. KP education system has always been the center of focus during the decade. Quality and good governance was the key motto of the decade, which is a really debatable issue. During the decade, monitoring mechanism was strengthened by introducing IMU for accountability of the teachers. Initially, it was a project mode, which later on became an authority. Teachers induction program was started for the newly recruited teachers. Teachers were trained in the subject science, maths, and English. COVID-19 pandemic really had great impact on humanity and especially on education system. In KP and education in KP scenario, and even across the country, where we are lacking the technologies, distance education, UK financing provide us opportunity to provide audio and video material for a learning process. Provision of ECE and play areas in KP schools, provision of teachers at schools to cover the gap of students-teacher ratio, and a number of other initiatives were taken in transforming the education to a modern education. KP education sees transformation in the shape of DPD, restructuring, arrangement of CPD, continuous professional development day for already inducted teachers to be equipped with modern techniques, even providing the best technical assistance in every field of education. Apart from this, we need to concentrate on the quality of our education. I don't know whether I have to mention it here or not, but it is our bad luck that our government teacher is highly qualified teachers comparing with the private sector, especially in rural areas. And the fee structure of the private schools in rural areas as a minimum 700, 500,000, maximum 1,500. But in the public sector, all you know how much we spend on a student. But the bad luck is here that my highly qualified teachers don't trust himself. In the morning, he take his kid with him and drop it in a school where there is no facility, which he has at his own school. He drop his kids with the low-paid teacher, and he goes to the school where he teaches to the kids of others. If this is not addressed, how can we get the quality? In the name of regularization, we are not supporting the private sector. We should encourage the private sector because private sector is almost helping us 30 to 40% in educating our kids. But in shape of taxes, in shape of registration, many other things, we are trying to squeeze them. I think we should minimize all these things to encourage them so they can educate more kids. Majority of our schools are damaged due to militancy as well as flood in the last 2 decades, particularly in the merged areas. In present scenario, we are not in the position to maintain without cooperation of UK government special attention. So it is a humble submission as well as request to please continue your cooperation till achievement of target. At the last, really I appreciate your matchless cooperation in the field of education. The UK government provided to us, or they are providing to us. Thank you all.
मेरे ख्याल एज मिनिस्टर तो बहुत बड़ा इशू है फ्लड हिट स्कूल्स का, गुड लक करेंगे। गुलाम फरीद साहब आपसे रिक्वेस्ट है कि जितनी मुख्तर बात कर सकें बिकॉज जो मोर ने भी जाना है और बट आई थिंक आई एम सर्विंग एज सेक्रेटरी पंजाब स्कूल्स एजुकेशन डिपार्टमेंट, you must be having a lot of insights to share, and I hope we have more opportunities to listen you. Yeah, but please.
Force me to be most, sir.
So I just wanted to be little, I mean.
Thank you very much, Suman bhai. Let me, at the very outset, frankly admit that whenever it comes to education, I find it really difficult to figure out where to start. Not that I find it any easier to figure out when and where to stop, but let me start with a cliche. I think it's a universal cliche. Public sector education in Punjab, or for that matter in Pakistan, sorry Advisor Saab if it is different in KP, public sector education is a mess. It's a total mess. It's a disaster. It's a nightmare. And when I say that it's in such a messy situation, you'll definitely ask why. Why? Because nobody is speaking for education. When it comes to lip service, education tops the priority list of almost all the governments, but it is rarely reflected in the actions, the things that actually matter on the ground. The voice is fast leaving the public education sector. Let's frankly, all of us, try to resolve and figure it out who actually is speaking for education, public sector education, who is advocating for it, Madam, yes, I know you are doing that, but the voice is leaving. In democracies, you have to lobby for funds. But that's a universal truth. Who is lobbying for education, public sector education in Pakistan? Those whose voice matter are not major stakeholders. If I ask this audience, this hall, including myself, how many of us send our kids to public sector schools? Can anyone dare raise their hands? So hardly any. You. So my compliments to you, and my sympathies too. So I was talking about public sector schools, okay. But then exceptions are there to prove the rule. So our policy making, again a cliche, is kind of elitist. And some of you might find it a strong term. We are in the middle of an educational apartheid. That is, at least that is true to me. The difference between the haves and the have-nots is very much visible in the public sector schools and the private sector schools. So that, to me, is one major reason why we are here, why we are where we are. Excuse me. So, unless we have a sense of urgency around the discourse about education, nobody discusses this topic. If we are discussing it, somebody can accuse us of having some business interests or some vested interest. Otherwise, as far as the government, the political parties, they have it in their manifestos. But as I said earlier, when it comes to actual realization of those objectives, it is like more like camera lights in action. So it's more like that. So the greatest thing that worries me is lack of seriousness, lack of urgency, lack of that sense of emergency. That concern is not there. There is no robust debate around education. If it weren't for FCDO, we wouldn't be having this 2 days conference. We wouldn't be discussing education. So, sorry, Sumanta, if I'm not speaking in the chronological order or I'm more random. So, data is the first word in your slide. So, we are overloaded with data. In my frivolous moments, which are not infrequent, I call my PMIU, I still own it because I was there as secretary. I call PMIU data go down, not even data warehouse. Well, we have lots of data. We are flooded with data, but there is not a single analyst of data at PMIU. But that is no big deal. Even if we have a qualified professional person to analyze that data, nobody is going to use that. Because, again, the political economy dictates otherwise. Data says one thing, and we are obliged to do something entirely different. Why? Because it is politically expedient. So, Suman Sahab, you talked about the role of education sector, the role of Secretary or Minister of Education is for both for public and private schools. But we are regulating private schools, but I personally believe that the physician should first heal himself. So let's forget about private sector education. They are doing a wonderful job. There are issues that can be a topic for another seminar dedicated to that topic. But I am focusing on public sector education, where the children from the poorest of the poor families are forced to, except for that lady in front of me, send their kids. So what are we doing about them? Then you talk about out-of-school children. Out-of-school children is a phantom we've been chasing for far too long, but unfortunately without any success. And a bigger question is, what are we doing with the kids whose parents have trusted public sector education and sent their kids through those schools? What treatment are we giving them? What kind of education are we imparting them? That's a bigger question. Yes, we try to resolve that issue too. We try to bring out-of-school children to schools, but that's again a complex issue. That is not related to education. Mostly, that is about literacy and non-formal education. For example, if a secretary finds a 12-year-old student, old out-of-school child who has never been to a school, what can that secretary do about this child? A 12-year-old cannot be enrolled at any stage. And that is exactly why we created that literacy and non-formal education department. So, but generally, we are blamed for all those out-of-school kids. Politicization, my colleague Dr. Sham has already touched on that. Education department is heavily politicized. If one legislation we require on emergent basis, that is to isolate it completely from politics, just like armed forces or judiciary. Somebody can say how non-political they are, but that is beside the point. So, I'm yet to see a person, an MPA, when I was Secretary of School Education, and I usually shared this concern with my visitors, who were mostly MNAs, MPAs, ministers. I used to tell them, I'm yet to see an MPA or a minister for that matter who comes to me and complains about the poor quality of education in their respective schools. Whenever they would come for teacher transfer. Transfer this teacher to far place, transfer this teacher, and they'll have stories. Obviously, they are in dire need of that transfer. Their family life is being disturbed. Things have come to such a pass that if I don't transfer that lady teacher, then divorce is on the cards. And by God, I have heard people complaining me after I was no longer Secretary of Education. Fareed, you didn't oblige me there. Now the lady stands divorced. So the second, on development side, whenever they come, they might ask about upgradation of schools without knowing, without having a solid case, what purpose that upgradation is going to serve. So political economy matters. And when it comes to school education department, it matters really significantly. Then there is the sociological context. Why do we accuse just our teachers of negligence, of being delinquent? Are we satisfied with our police personnel? Are we satisfied with our revenue officials? Okay, thank you. So this sociological context is also very relevant. I usually, once I was at that Global Partnership for Education Conference, Saima and Madam Bela was also there. I happened to run into Land Pritchett, and I asked him a few questions, and his response was, Mr. Secretary, you're asking me very hard questions. We consultants are not used to readily answer them. So these are hard questions. I have more questions than answers to the issues. So, and as civil servants, we are supposed to play second fiddle to our political bosses. And there's no harm in that. That is our legal and constitutional mandate. That's our role that the law gives us. To wind it up, education sector, public education sector remains a formidable challenge. But the problem is the response is not equal to the challenge. It doesn't meet the challenge. It is far too inadequate. Education is woefully underfunded. I can talk on and on about the issues, but since I'm being reminded of the paucity of time, so it remains woefully underfunded. Per student cost in Punjab is lowest in the region, not to speak of Great Britain or America, which are spending 100 times or 150 times more than we are spending here. So these are hard facts. School meal programs, there is no concept of it here in Pakistan. India, population-wise, a nightmare, is doing that. In SAR countries, there are only 2 countries, including Pakistan, where schools are not offering meals to kids. Otherwise, there are 80 countries in the world that are providing school meals to kids. So, I can go on and on, but out of this dismal picture that I have painted, I'm sorry for that. The good thing is that we are talking about education. The good thing is that the realization is there. We need more advocacy, because I fear if World Bank, FCDO, other donor organizations don't come to our aid, because it's not just the aid, it's not the money that they bring with us, they actually give us a wake-up call. Do something about it. So that is very important. Otherwise, the space for dialogue on education is shrinking very fast. I fear that one day the conversation around education might end entirely, and none of us in this hall would like that to happen. So I appreciate the work, the dedicated work during the last decade done by FCDO and World Bank. They have done a remarkable job, but we need, ultimately, education is our problem and we need to fix it. There are no quick fixes. There are no silver bullets. It's not going to happen overnight. It's a slow, patient, painful work in progress. And the best we can do is tinker, keep tinkering towards betterment and improvement. That's the best we can do. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ghulam Farid Sahab, and message is well noted. More conversations, more advocacy, more policy influencing, and more voice. I'll request Wasim Ajmal Sahab. Wasim Ajmal Sahab is Federal Secretary Education as of today, I believe. But more importantly, he is really providing technical guidance to turnaround PI as a federal think tank that can take lead in this topic of data, design, and other stuff, and trying to design some very innovative solutions around market and public sector also. So over to you, Wasim Sahab. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Salman Saab, and thank you very much, organizers, for inviting me to share my thoughts on the subject. The challenge before the last speaker is not to, repeat anything which you guys have been listening for the past 2 days. I understand you might have, discussed too many things about the entire, life cycle of educational reforms, from infrastructure to teacher training to pedagogy or to assessments and, learning losses, out-of-school children. So I just can't speak all about that. The only thing which I've been hearing, a lot of work was done, a lot of, talks were, heard that the Chief Minister was doing this, the donors were spending money, but where do we end up? And we all know that 22.8 million out-of-school children, the highest in, the world. It was previously, unfortunately, we were second, but now we are the number one, in that respect. So that is to the extent of access. What about quality? We all know the learning poverty levels, the kids who can't, even speak a single sentence. I don't want to repeat, I'm sure these things have been discussed here. But the point is, which I want to highlight is, which might not have been discussed and slightly, try to touch those prohibited zones. And this issue of political economy, the market, the role of the state, and why these politicians and the bureaucrats have, not been able to achieve that level with that kind of spending also. And do they really want to do that? That's the biggest question. I will, start by this. I read a book, I think, a few years back, whose title was Too Much Aid and Too Little Development, probably Dr. Sami Altaf. And then if we discuss what is the real intention of the state, or the politicians and bureaucrats are obviously part of that. Do we really want to impart education to our kids? Because the results and the challenges, and we keep on saying that politicians don't do this, don't increase finances, come and only for their own kind of sifarish or recommendations, which only strengthen them or help them to get re-elected. So in a political economy where the elite captures the resources of the state, the biggest question the academicians have discussed a lot, that perhaps they don't want to do it because it's just simply natural that if the elite starts imparting education, a certain space will be start slipping out of their hands, because we know that if the elite at the these masses demand more financing for the education, then someone has to pay the taxes. So who is going to pay the tax? It's the elite. So why won't they like to spend more money on education? It would never happen like that. We have heard about that the market would perhaps do much better. Is it really so? It's a great contradiction, On the one hand, we say education is a public good, and we say education is a right as per Constitution, and then we say the market will supply it. How is that possible? If it is a right, it doesn't have to be supplied, it has to be demanded through legal means, through constitutional means. So there is, again, a debate which I don't want to, this is not the level, that whether it's a public good, education, or it's a private good, or, we keep discussing it's something in between, kind of a common good. So if it is, private good, the market has to actually aggregate the demand and allocate the resources, then what is the debate about public education? And if it is, public good, then we need to see what is the role of the state. What does really state want here? I'm reminded of the way public education system evolved in India. What was state really aiming for at that point in time? Let me just quote you, all of you are, familiar with the name of the gentleman, Lord Macaulay. Some of our British friends definitely remember him much more than us. His, minute on education, which he wrote in 1837, and one of his famous speech in the British Parliament was, are we to keep the people of India ignorant in order that we may keep them submissive? Or do we think that we can give them knowledge without awakening ambition? Or do we mean to awaken ambition and provide it with no legitimate means of vent? So these are the kinds of intentions and objectives of the state political economy systems, political and economic systems, under which this whole gamut of education reforms actually operates. That is why the secretaries say that these are gimmicks. That, because we all know there was good data, there was good design, of the reforms, and, the capacity of the systems, of the people as well as of these institutions was, improved. But the political alignment, somehow we say the political will was missing, and that is why it couldn't continue. So what is this political will? Actually, they don't want to do it. That is the elephant, in the room, which perhaps this conference needs to think about. And even, if we talk about the market needs laborers. Market needs low-paid skilled workers. So why should the market come and provide the quality education to the students? So the market would remain inequitable. The market response would never come up to the quality challenge, would never come up to to address the question of equity. These are all, political economy questions. And I'm sorry to provoke these kinds of ideas because I've been asked to comment on that. And unless we actually address this larger systemic issue, and we all know that the educational reforms here and there in piecemeals address the teacher training system, come up with investing in the toilets for the girls' education, or come up with a better curriculum. All these piecemeal measures are never going to address the holistic, systemic challenge. Education system, by the way, we need to understand that the entire question of education is a political question. It is not a technical question. I'm reminded why, how do we remember that how did actually the China address the question of literacy? I mean, there was a complete, state ideology behind that. And they did it through Little Red Book. How did we, know that the Cubans came up to the challenge of literacy? Was there? That is the kind of political ideology of the state which is needed if we really want to, address this question of, but why should they do it? Because it threatens their control over the resources, the elite capture of the economy, which would never allow to reallocate the resources, and which would never allow to threaten their hold on power systems. And this is where, we need to ask whether these donor-driven programs, do they really, contribute to, kind of liberate these masses, or do they contribute to perpetuate their controls? We need to ask these questions seriously. And this is the forum Salman Sahab has provided to me, and I can share my ideas. These are big questions. I mean, I was attending the conference in Doha, and I reached here, and there a young, young boy asked this question from probably the Director General of the transformation, world education, UN education transformation, something like that. I remember that. And he asked the same question. How would it happen? Whether the market is the real answer. And that, Ronaldo, I think, I'm sorry not to remember his name. And he said there was a great debate even in UK about that. That the only, not only the education system alone, but in fact the larger political as well as economic system is needed to address this question. Alone, we talk about the holistic, mindset within the education paraphernalia, but, we heard that lobbying is required. Who is going to lobby? So we have also heard, if Faisal Bari and Bela and Andarabi is writing, tell us that there is not enough demand from the parents, and the demand aggregation from the parents, or, that is actually the reason. But we all know that even, a huge, spectacular program designed by, again, FCDO, Alif Elan, which tried to create this kind of demand, but it fizzled out. Because, if we, see that those boys and girls who have been, struck into this poverty cycle from years and years, and their parents, and they have internalized their conditions of poverty and their, even desire for freedom, how can they raise that demand? So, unfortunately, my, the Bela and our colleagues, some of who are on the sitting with me stage, and we've been discussing as part of a coalition when we came back from Brazil. What we saw there, what really made the difference? One was that the political leadership, was a kind of leadership who actually created a movement for that. And secondly, Musharraf Zaidi was with me, and we were going to schools, meeting communities, meeting the teachers, and I was amazed, and I told Musharraf, whichever school we go and visit, Paulo Freire's picture and his quotes are, written on the walls. So that means the philosophy of education, the movement behind that, unless that is, the real call, unless we link this demand with the social justice, with, the kind of constitutional, rights, it's not going to come through the market, it's not going to come through the political system, it's the larger, linkage of the education system with political economic systems as well. So I think these are some of my thoughts, but having said that, that doesn't mean, the situation is entirely, not in, at a point where we cannot change it. We have discussed this with, our coalition partners, that we actually need coalitions from civil society. Who could actually lead that? It's not going to come. And obviously, the persons from the state who are actually in one sense actors and part of that, whether they are bureaucrats or whether they are politicians. Both are part of that, privileged, elite, captured system. And even, as part of bureaucrats, once the projects come in, our salaries and our vehicles and tours, everything, we enjoy those perks and privileges. And, that is why, and we then say, that it's our duty to just oblige to the political recommendations. Yes, if we want to perpetuate the system. The point is again that a civil society call for action, that is where, things will start getting changed. Unless we, focus upon that, these technicalities of, we are doing, trying to create digital platforms, we are trying to create, a lot of tech interventions. and lot of kind of market encouragement. I was even what I'm talking here is not that what I do in my office, by the way. There I keep doing that small technical things, and even I was discussing with Salman that we want to involve private sector, and they can come up and private partnership with us and build schools. And we work with a lot of NGOs sitting here. There was a question that vacant seats, and Khadija knows that we utilized it in a manner that we started, the budget which was available for us for the vacant seats, and outsourced it to Teach for Pakistan and started using their services. So the point is this civil society coalition, along with right kind of activist members from political spectrum, as well as from the bureaucratic spectrum, as well as from the media, that needs to be the focal point. And they need to, unless they would, come up with some kind of these kind of political activism is needed in order to, bring some kind of a change. I'll finish with, a standard quote from the Qaid, which I picked up for closing this. I wanted to begin with Lord Macaulay and close with the Qaid's quote. By the way, this elite capture theory which I am talking about, it's not mine. Those who are interested to read, the Ben Ansel readings, and he has used this term of selectorate. These selectorate, who are basically those actors, including bureaucrats and politicians, who actually do not want to let go of their privileges and their, positions within the systems. So, I would say that actually education reforms is not a kind of, a process which begins at a point and ends at a point. It's a kind of, I would say, it's not a, race of 100 meters. It's a relay race with no, finish. It is a continuous process, and as long as, right kind of people can, gather together, this conundrum is going to, prevail like that. The Qaid quote is that without education, it is complete darkness, and with education, it is light. Education is a matter of life and death to our nation. The world is moving so fast that if you do not educate yourselves, you will not only completely left behind, but you will be finished up. So no sacrifice of time or personal comfort should be regarded too great for the advancement of cause of courage. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wasim Saab, for a relatively, I would not say the radical, but a refreshing perspective on that. And and of course, where there is a elite capture, we also need to be mindful of the elite exit from the education sector. We have abandoned using any public sector education or health services, so to say, even the middle class. So your point is very well taken. And when he was referring to the selectorate, I was thinking of some people who are in this sector, but maybe we can use a term like intellectocrats, who are more like bureaucrats, but still into intellectualism. But it seems how he's trying to merge intellectualism with certain kind of popular activism, which should be fine for the civil society. But thank you very much to all the panelists for their contribution. We are grateful. You want us to leave?
Thank you. No, thank you so much to the esteemed panelists. I would now like to welcome our chief guest for today, the Deputy Chairman, Senate, Mirza Muhammad Afridi. Please join me here in you're giving your closing remarks. As we were speaking in the other room, we discovered that you are also a huge champion of education. You come from the KP's merged areas and have been doing a lot in both your personal and your official capacity for education. So we're very pleased to have you with us.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. نگران وزیر تعلیم کے پی وسیم اجمل صاحب, غلام فرید صاحب, احتشام انور صاحب, ڈاکٹر سلمان ہمایون صاحب, اینڈ لیڈیز اینڈ جینٹلمین, السلام علیکم. سب سے پہلے تو میں شکریہ ادا کرتا ہوں کہ اس سیمینار میں مجھے موقع دیا کہ ایجوکیشن کے بارے میں بات کریں. پولیٹیشین پہ تو بہت باتیں ہوئی, میں نے سنی بھی. آئی ایم اے پولیٹیشین, اچھی بات ہے, ہمیں اپنی کمزوریوں کا بھی پتہ چل جائے گا کہ کہاں پہ ہم کمزور ہیں اور کہاں پہ ہم اسٹرانگ ہیں. دیکھیں, آئی ایم بلانگ فرام ایکس فاٹا. میرا تعلق جو ہے وہ قبائلی علاقے سے ہے اور اب چونکہ مرج ہو چکا ہے. اینڈ میں سمجھتا ہوں کہ آپ لوگوں نے جو باتیں کی ہیں, مجھے یہ بتائیں کہ آئی ایم بلانگ فرام فاٹا اینڈ دا ایریا از باڑا. تو باڑا میں ایجوکیشن سیکٹر سے کون گیا وہاں دیکھنے کے لیے؟ پولیٹیشین پہ بات ہوئی تو میں بھی سوال کر لوں. آپ گئے؟ جی, آپ کھڑے ہو جائیں, مجھے بتائیں آپ کس جگہ پہ گئے؟ خیبر ایجنسی تو بہت بڑا ہے نا, باڑا گئے نا؟ ٹھیک ہے. علم بدر میں ایک اسکول ہے جہاں سے میں پڑھا ہوں, اینڈ آئی ایم 46 ایئر اولڈ. آئی ایم 46 ایئر اولڈ اینڈ اسٹل وہ ٹاٹ والا اسکول ہے, ابھی بھی وہ ٹاٹ والا ہے. تو کیا تبدیلی لے کے آئے آپ؟ پولیٹیشین ہے نا, تو پولیٹیشین نے جو کیا ہے آپ اپنا بتائیں, آپ کیا تبدیلی لے کے آئیں؟ واٹ یو گیو, یو نو, آپ کیا چینج لے کے آئیں, اس چینج کے بارے میں مجھے بتائیں ذرا.
وہ تو یہ کہتے ہیں سر کہ ہمیں گورنمنٹ سے فنڈ نہیں ملتا, اس لیے وہاں پہ کرسیاں نہیں ہیں, وہاں پہ کتابیں نہیں. جو میری ابھی یہ
تو پولیٹیشین پیسے کھا گیا,
یہ تو مجھے نہیں پتا,
یہ میں
لیکن میں عرض کر رہا ہوں کہ وہ یہ کہتے ہیں کہ ہمیں پیسے نہیں ملتے, ہمارے پاس فرنیچر نہیں ہے, ہمارے پاس کتابیں نہیں ہیں, اور یہاں پہ جو بھی حالات ہیں, ٹیچر نہیں ہیں. وہاں پہ 6 کلاسیں ہیں, 2 ٹیچر.
6 کلاسیں؟
6 کلاسیں ٹوٹل, 2 ٹیچر.
جی, یو آر رانگ. ایک کلاس ہے اور وہ بھی,
میں تو باڑا کے کچھ اسکولوں کی بات کر.
نو, میں بتا سکتا ہوں. آئی بلانگ فرام دیئر, میں نے پڑھا وہاں سے. ٹھیک ہے, میں ٹاٹ پہ بیٹھتا تھا, ایک ہی کمرہ ہے, وہی ٹاٹ پڑا ہوا ہے, اور میں تصویریں شیئر کر دیتا ہوں آپ کے ساتھ. کیا چینجنگ لے کے آئیں؟ پولیٹیشین نہیں. میں آپ کو بتاتا ہوں کہ کہاں پہ یہ مسئلہ آ رہا ہے, ویسے مسئلہ کدھر سے آ رہا ہے اور کیوں نہیں ہو رہا. دیٹ از, یو نو, سو پلیز بیٹھیں. تھینک یو. بات یہ, یو نو, بات یہ ہے کہ میں یہ سبجیکٹ جو ہے نا, میں بھی بڑا باریکی سے دیکھتا ہوں, اور دا لاسٹ 3 ایئرس میں اس کے اوپر ہی کام کر رہا ہوں, تعلیم کے اوپر, کہ ہم تعلیم کو کیسے, اچھی ایجوکیشن کیسے دیں, اسپیشلی اس علاقوں میں جہاں پہ ہمارا بلوچستان ہے اور ہمارا فاٹا ہے, ان کے بچوں کے لیے. اینڈ تھینکس ٹو دس گورنمنٹ, کیونکہ انہوں نے ایکنیکس سے ابھی 8.6 بلین پیسے دیے ہیں, جو فاٹا کے 5000 اسٹوڈنٹس کو مل گئے ہیں جو وہاں پہ پڑھیں گے, جس میں میڈیکل بھی ہے, انجینئرنگ بھی ہے, سب کچھ ہے. لیکن مجھے یہ بتائیں, آپ یہاں کے سابقہ, اب تعلیم کے کوئی سیکٹری بیٹھے ہوئے نا, ایڈیشنل سیکٹری 2 بیٹھے, یو آر رائٹ ناؤ. ہاں, مجھے یہ بتائیں کہ پرسوں ٹیسٹ ہوا ہے NAB کا, فاٹا کے میڈیکل بچوں کا, کتنے بچوں نے اپلائی کیا اس میں؟ I want to know this. پولیٹیشین ہے نا, تو بیوروکریٹس بھی بتائیں. I want to know this question. بات یہ نہیں ہے, بات یہ 14,300 بچوں نے اپلائی کیا, جو صرف 265 بچوں کے وہاں پہ اپلائی, وہ میرٹ پہ آئیں گے. تو 14,300 بچے جو فاٹا سے انہوں نے اپلائی کیا ہے کیونکہ فری ایجوکیشن کے لیے, تو باقی بچے کہاں جائیں گے؟ ان کے پاس تو پیسے نہیں, کون پڑھائے گا ان کو؟ بات دیکھیں, بات یہ ہے کہ ہم نے سب مل کے اس کو چلنا ہوگا. صرف میرا کام نہیں ہے کہ میں ایجوکیشن سیکٹر کے اوپر کام کروں اور میں باغ دوڑ کروں, اور میرے بچے ہر سال جو ہے, پچھلے سال 265 بچے میڈیکل میں گئے, PMC HEC, سارا دن ان کے ساتھ ہم بیٹھے ہوتے ہیں کہ کائنڈلی ان کا کوٹا بڑھائیں, ان کو یونیورسٹی میں ایڈمیشن ملنا چاہیے, اور سارا دن میرا یہی کام ہے. آج میں نے ایک بچی کا فیس جمع کیا, 11,06,000 سمتھنگ روپے میں نے اپنی جیب سے دیے. کیوں؟ میں کیوں دوں, اور میں کتنے بچوں کو دوں؟ مطلب یہ میرا کام ہے ذاتی کہ میں اکیلا میں ہی کام کروں اور میں کتنے بچوں کو پڑھاؤں. یہ ہم سب کا کام ہے. ہم نے سب مل کے اس کو پڑھانا لے کے جانا پڑے گا. اپنی ایجوکیشن سیکٹر کو مضبوط کرنا پڑے گا. اینڈ آئی ریئلی تھینکس ٹو UK اینڈ برٹش ایمبیسی دیٹ آپ لوگوں نے ہمیں جو FCDO جو ہے اس میں 900 بلین پاؤنڈز دیے ہیں. بہت کم ہے کیونکہ ہمارا علاقہ بہت بڑا ہے, لیکن ہم امید کرتے ہیں آپ ہمیں اور بھی دیں گے, ہمارے بچوں کو پڑھائیں گے. لیکن یہ ان کا بھی کام نہیں ہے, یہ ہم ایز اے پاکستانی ہمارا کام ہے. میں تو ان کا شکریہ ادا کرتا ہوں, NGOs کا شکریہ ادا کرتا ہوں کہ وہ آتے ہیں ہمارے بچوں کو پڑھاتے ہیں. اور ہمیں ایز اے پاکستانی ہمیں سوچنا چاہیے کہ ہم اپنے بچوں کو کیسے پڑھائیں. اور میرے پڑوس میں ایک بچہ ہے تعلیم کے بغیر. میں قسم کھا کے کہتا ہوں کہ میں نے ایک بچی کو کلاس 5 سے لے کے FSC تک پڑھا دیا, اور وہ ایک ہارن بنانے والا, اس کا باپ ہارن بناتا تھا, گاڑیوں کا ہارن نہیں ہوتا وہ بناتا تھا. اب بھی FSC اس نے کر لیا, اور مجھے اس دن اس نے بھیجا کہ سر میں تو FSC کر لیا, بہت مہربانی. سو میرا کام ہے کہ میں اپنے پڑوس میں بچے کو دیکھوں کہ وہ تعلیم کے لیے جا رہا ہے کہ نہیں. میرے بچے تو بڑے اچھے اسکول میں جاتے ہیں, 20-20 ہزار روپے میں اس کی فیس دیتا ہوں. کیوں غریب کے بچے کا دل نہیں کرتا اسکول جانے کو؟ کرتا ہے. اور پھر ایک صاحب نے کہا کہ پولیٹیشین نہیں چاہتے کہ اسکل جو ہے وہ زیادہ ڈیولپ ہو جائے ورنہ لیبر نہیں ہوں گے. کہا ہے نا آپ نے. میں آپ کو بتاتا ہوں, مجھے یہ بتائیں کہ ہم اپنے بچوں کے ذہن کیوں بناتے ہیں کہ آپ بڑے ہو کہ آپ 1 لاکھ روپے تنخواہ دار بنیں گے. آپ ان کو بزنس سکھائے نا. آپ نے اسکل جو ہے میٹرک کے بعد اسکل پروگرام لے کے آئے نا, ان کو بتائیں, ان سے پوچھیں کہ بھائی آپ نے کیا بننا ہے. ڈاکٹر بننا ہے, آپ نے بزنس مین بننا ہے, اپنے آپ کو کیسے سروائیو کرنا ہے. ہم نے تو آج تک وہ پلاننگ ہی نہیں کی, کیونکہ بتاتے نہیں. ہمارا تو مائنڈ سیٹ یہ ہے کہ ہم بچوں کو دکھائیں کہ آپ نے لاکھ روپے تنخواہ دار کیسے بننا ہے, بس. ان کو یہ نہیں سکھاتے کہ بزنس کیسے کرنا ہے. ان کو سکھائیں گے تو اوپر آئیں گے نا. ہمارے پاس تو پلان ہی نہیں ہے. پھر نمبر 1. نمبر 2 یہ کہ ہم ایگریکلچر بیسڈ کنٹری ہے نا, ہمارا ایگریکلچر پہ زیادہ دارمدار ہے. کیا ہماری ایگریکلچر یونیورسٹی کا کام ہے کہ صرف وہ بتائے کہ سیڈ کیا ہوتی ہے؟ میرے گھر میں آم کا درخت ہے, مجھے نہیں پتا کہ اس آم کے درخت کو, اس آم کو پکانا کیسے. ہر روزانہ میرے سر پہ ایک آم گرتا ہے اور میں رکھ دیتا ہوں, مجھے پتہ نہیں کیسے پکانا ہے اس کو. میں ایگزامپل دے رہا ہوں, ٹھیک ہے. اور ایک بڑا امپورٹنٹ, میں آپ لوگوں کو ڈانٹ نہیں رہا, واقعی میں میرے دل سے یہ باتیں نکل رہی ہیں کیونکہ میں سمجھانا چاہتا ہوں. دس از ویری امپورٹنٹ. جب مجھے کہا گیا, بلیو می, کہ ایجوکیشن کے اوپر بات ہے, میں لاہور جا رہا تھا, میرا سیکٹری پروٹوکول بیٹھا ہوا ہے, میں نے کہا کینسل کرو, میں نے ادھر جانا ہے. میری میٹنگ تھی, میں نے قسم سے وہ بھی کینسل کری صرف اس چیز کے لیے, کیونکہ میرے بہت نزدیک ہے. دیکھیں, میں ہمیشہ ایک بات کرتا رہتا ہوں, اور میں اس طرح کا پولیٹیشین بھی نہیں ہوں, مجھے وہ پالیٹکس نہیں آتا. میں اسٹریٹ فارورڈ, میں نے کام کرنا ہے تو کرنا ہے, نہیں کرنا تو نہیں کرنا. آپ نے کہا کہ ٹیچرز کو الیکشن کے دن نکالیں, بالکل نہ دیں. میں چاہتا ہوں ٹیچر نہ جائے. چلے یہ بھی مسئلہ حل کر دیتے ہیں, بتائیں, ہم وہ قانون سازی کر دیتے ہیں, نکالیں اس چیز کو تاکہ یہ ٹرانسفر بھی ختم ہو جائے. بالکل ہونی چاہیے. آئی ایم ایگریڈ ود یو کہ وہ دوبارہ آئے گا, MNA بنے گا اور MPA بنے. نو, ہمیں نہیں بننا, ہمیں اپنے بچوں کو پڑھانا ہے, ہم نے تعلیم دینی ہے. اس چیز کی طرف نہ جائیں پلیز. اب اس چیز کے اوپر قانون سازی, میں تیار ہوں, سینیٹ آف پاکستان تیار ہے اس چیز کے لیے, لے کے آئے ہیں, کرتے ہیں اس کو قانون سازی. میں آپ کو ایک چیز بتانا چاہتا ہوں, دیکھیں, بہت ضروری بات, اور اس سے میں نے سیکھا ہے, میں چاہتا ہوں کہ آپ لوگ بھی اسے سیکھیں. آج سے 10 سال پہلے میرے کمرے کا نا ایئر کنڈیشن خراب ہو گیا, اور اس کا ایئر کنڈیشن کا پانی جو ہے نا وہ اندر ٹپکنا شروع ہو گیا, ٹک ٹک کر کے. اور وہ ہوا کیا کہ وہ جب میں نے دیکھا کہ میرا تو کارپیٹ گیلا ہو جائے گا, یہ تو خراب ہو جائے گا, یہ کیا ہوگا. میں ایک چھوٹی ڈسٹ بن لے کے آیا, اس کے نیچے رکھا, تو وہ تھوڑی دیر بعد میں نے سوچا کہ یار یہ تو چھوٹا ہے, تو بڑی بالٹی لے کے آیا, اس کے نیچے رکھ دیا. رات کا ٹائم ہے, میں نے کہا کہاں ٹھیک کروں گا. صبح میں اٹھا ہوں تو وہ بالٹی بھی بھری ہوئی تھی اور میرا کارپیٹ بھی گیلا تھا ایک قطرے سے. تو آئی ریئلائز کہ اس معاشرے میں ایک قطرے کے برابر میں بھی بڑی اہمیت رکھتا ہوں. فرد واحد ہر ایک آدمی کی ضرورت ہے, ہر ایک آدمی کو چاہیے کہ اپنے آپ کو اس چیز میں کنٹریبیوٹ کرے, وہ ایجوکیشن میں اور آگے آئے. آپ میری بات سمجھ رہے ہیں نا؟ تو اس ایک قطرے نے وہ بالٹی بھر دی. تو میں جب صبح اٹھا میں نے کہا یہ کیا ہوا, یہ تو ایک قطرے نے بالٹی بھر لی. سو اٹس مینس کہ میں اکیلا تو بڑی اہمیت رکھتا ہوں. یہ نہ سوچیں کہ میں کیا ہوں, کس پوزیشن پہ ہوں, کہاں کیا ہوں, شرم کی بات نہیں. فارگیٹ دس, بھول جائیں, شرم کو بھول جائیں, آگے بڑھیں. ہمارے غریب عوام کو, ہمارے لوگوں کو آگے, یہ جتنے لوگ بیٹھے ہوئے ہیں آئی بلیو کہ آپ ایک ایک بچے کو پڑھا سکتے ہیں. مجھے یہ بتائیں آپ میں سے کس نے کتنے بچوں کو پڑھایا؟ ویری گڈ. یہ میں چاہتا ہوں, یہ میں چاہتا ہوں یہ جذبہ ہر پاکستانی کے اندر ہو, اور یہ میسج دے دیں قسم سے کوئی بچہ جو ہے تعلیم کے بغیر نہیں رہے گا. اگر ہم ایک ایک بچے کو بھی پڑھائیں گے نا تو نہیں رہ سکتا. اس کے لیے پالیسی بنائے. میں تو میرا یہ ایسا سبجیکٹ ہے کہ میں یقین مانے میرے پاس اتنی وہ لمبی داستانیں ہیں. افغانستان میں ایجوکیشن بند ہو گیا ہے میڈیکل کا. فیمیلز ہماری بچیاں تھیں 105, وہ بیچاری روزانہ رلتی رہیں اس بات کے اوپر کہ ہم چونکہ طالبان نے پالیسی بنا دی کہ میڈیکل کی بچیاں نہیں پڑھیں گی جب تک ان کے ساتھ ہم ایک پراپر پالیسی نہیں بناتے. وہ یہاں آئی, رلتے رہیں روڈ کے اوپر, کبھی ادھر کبھی ادھر. اور میں آواز ان لاہور, مجھے فون آیا, میں نے کہا فکر نہ کرو بچوں, میں آ رہا ہوں. میں آیا اور آئی کالڈ HEC, PMC, منسٹر اینڈ ایوری ون, ایون ان سینٹ. میں خود کھڑا ہو گیا, میں نے ان کے لیے بات کی کہ یہ ان بچیوں کا جو مستقبل ہے ہم نے خراب نہیں کرنا, ان کو ہم نے دینا ہے. اور کل یا مے بی نیکسٹ ویک ان کا ٹیسٹ ہونے والا ہے. تو ان کے پاس اٹیسٹمنٹ کے لیے جو اٹیچ کرتے ہیں ڈاکومنٹس, میں نے کہا اس کو بھی ویو کریں, کوئی بات نہیں, پہلے ٹیسٹ لے لیں اس کے بعد ڈاکومنٹس لے کے آئیں گے. تو میں نہیں چاہتا کہ ہمارے بچوں کا ٹائم بھی ضائع ہو. تو اس بچیوں کا جو ہے اس کے لیے کون بیٹھا تھا ہمارے ایجوکیشن منسٹری سے؟ کون آیا تھا؟ کوئی نہیں, کوئی چھوڑ نہیں رہا تھا. میں نے آواز اٹھائی. اب میرا کام تو نہیں ہے کہ میں ہر چیز کے لیے میں ہی آواز اٹھاؤں, تو میں اکیلا ایک پولیٹیشین تو نہیں کر سکتا نا. ہمیں سب کو مل کے چلنا پڑے گا اس چیز کے اوپر. مجھے یہ بتائیں کہ ابھی تک فاٹا جب مرج ہوا اس کے پاس آپ لوگوں نے ایک پالیسی بنا دی تھی, ایجوکیشن پالیسی. کیا آپ لوگوں نے بنائی؟ کون جواب دے گا اس کا؟ نہیں بنائی, ابھی تک نہیں بنی. یہ ویری گڈ, پلیز کلیپ کریں منسٹر صاحب کے لیے. اینڈ آئی ایکسپیکٹ, میرا بات یہ دیکھیں, بات یہ نہیں ہے کہ میں سوال کر رہا ہوں آپ لوگ مجھے اس کے اوپر, میں کوئی ڈانٹ بھی نہیں رہا آپ لوگوں کو, پھر سے کہہ رہا ہوں. میں یہ چیز لوگوں کو آپ لوگوں کو بتا رہا ہوں کہ یہ سبجیکٹ جو ہے نا یہ میرا اپنا سبجیکٹ ہے. آپ لوگ تو کم ہی اس کے ہوں گے کیونکہ سارا دن بچے میرے پاس آتے ہیں ہر سیکٹر سے, چاہے وہ میٹرک کے ہوں, چاہے وہ FEC کے ہوں, چاہے وہ میڈیکل کے ہوں, چاہے انجینئرنگ کے ہوں. انہوں نے میرا آفس دیکھا ہے کہ ڈپٹی چیئرمین صاحب کے آفس میں جانا ہے, بس وہی مسئلہ حل کریں گے. جس کے پاس ہاسٹل کے پیسے نہیں ہوتے, پیسے نہیں ہیں, بھائی میں کتنے پیسے دوں, میں اتنا امیر تھوڑی ہوں. بس ٹھیک ہے جتنا میرے سے ہو سکتا ہے دے دوں گا, کروں گا. لیکن بات یہ ہے کہ ہم سب ایز اے نیشن پاکستانی اس چیز کے اوپر کھڑا ہونا ہے تاکہ ہم اس چیز کو سمجھ سکیں کہ بہت ضروری ہے. اور جہاں سے میرا تعلق ہے, آپ لوگوں کو پتہ ہے ہماری آبادی کتنی ہے. منسٹر صاحب آپ تو ہمارے علاقے سے ہیں نا, خٹک صاحب ہیں, تو پتہ ہے آپ کو فاٹا کی کتنی آبادی ہے؟ 5.2 جو ابھی نیا سینسز آیا ہے. لیکن لاسٹ جب ہمارے وہ سینسز ہوئے تھے تو ہم 1 کروڑ سمتے 1 کروڑ 30 لاکھ لوگ تھے, اور دوبارہ نیا سینسز میں ہم 52 لاکھ ہو گئے. میں نے کب کدھر چلے گئے بھائی صاحب؟ آبادی بڑھتی ہے کہ گھٹتی ہے یہ بھی سمجھ نہیں آئی. تو مائیگریٹ ہوئے, اب علاقے میں پھر امن آ گیا ہے تو پھر واپس آنا تو ہے نا, تو کہاں چلے گئے؟ سو خیر اینی ہاؤ وہ لمبی ڈیٹیل ہے جس میں NFC وارڈ شامل ہے. اٹس لانگ ڈیبیٹ نا, ٹھیک ہے, آئی نو دیٹ. میں دیکھیں میں پھر وہ بات کرتا ہوں, میں اس طرح کا پولیٹیشین نہیں ہوں, میں تو بات کری کرتا ہوں اور میں چاہتا ہوں کہ کام ختم ہو جائے اور کل پہ کام چھوڑنا بھی نہیں چاہیے. تو اس لیے آپ نے جو پرومس کیا کہ پالیسی بنانی ہے تو آپ کائنڈلی کل مجھے اس کا بھیج دیں میرے آفس میں کہ جی پالیسی بن گئی. آئی نیڈ دیٹ, کیونکہ میرے ممبرز بھی مجھ سے پوچھتے ہیں نا جب ہاؤس میں کھڑے ہوتے ہیں کہ ڈپٹی چیئرمین صاحب اس کو کمیٹی میں بھیج دیں, تو میں پہلے دیکھتا ہوں کہ کیا یہ ٹھیک ہی کہہ رہا ہے نا, پھر اس کے بعد بھیجتا ہوں. So khair, anyhow, in short this, once again, मैं शुक्रिया अदा करता हूँ British High Commission का, and thank you madam for this supporting of this program, and Institute of Social Sciences, उनका भी शुक्रिया अदा करता हूँ, बाकी जितने मेंबर हैं. मेरी बात को बुरा ना मानिएगा, लेकिन मैं बेसिकली एजुकेशन जो है वो मेरे खुद दिल के बहुत करीब है. थैंक यू सो मच.
Thank you so much. And to close this two-day conference, I would like to invite Ms. Jo Moyer. Jo Moyer is the Development Director of the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, and she has over 20 years of experience working for the UK government at home and overseas. Jo's last appointment was as FCDO's Deputy Director for Human Development during the COVID pandemic, covering a range of global health issues including health systems, nutrition, climate, health, and sexual and reproductive health and rights. Thank you, Jo, for your patience, and thank you for joining us today. Please.
Assalamu alaikum. Good to see everyone. I recognize that I'm the last speaker here, and I'm what's keeping you between you and your evening. So I will be very brief. What I want to do is just to try and draw out some of the key reflections of the last few days, because I know that you've had an incredibly varied and rich discussion, and I particularly enjoyed this last panel. Secretary Saab, you're a revelation. Fantastic comments there, and bringing some of the realpolitik to the conversation. So let me just recap. Yesterday, our High Commissioner, Andrew Dalgleish, asked us all to think about making 3 simple commitments. And these were a commitment from each political party to implement 1 hour of reading a day for every child, a national learning assessment with progress on early grade literacy, and then for all political parties to provide a practical and budgeted commitment to safe, accessible and free transport to and from school. So some really interesting ideas there, and I hope you've had the chance to discuss them. As I say, I'm going to focus on some of the key reflections that you've all been coming up with over the last few days, and which I think can help bring about perhaps those 3 commitments, but also others to a reality. I've got 8. Bear with me, but I will be brief. So the first reflection is that donors should stand behind government. You know, that there is no sustainable public policy reform that can be imposed externally. And just to thank the Honourable Deputy Chairman of the Senate for pointing this out and reiterating that point. You know, this is for Pakistan and for Pakistan's leadership to take forward. And there's nothing that we as donors can do to impose anything. But what we can do is stand behind you and support you in your own conclusions and commitments. The second reflection I've got is the need to accelerate the shift in focus from access to education to quality education. I know there's been a lot of discussion about the quality of learning over the last couple of days. And in particular, the importance of this here and now because of the dropout rates. You know, with so many children out of school in Pakistan, Kim was telling me earlier that the number is now estimated to be 27 million children out of school here, accounting for the COVID pandemic and the floods as well. I mean, so anything we can do to make sure that that space at school is a valued space, that parents value it, that the children are getting something out of it, that is so important. The third reflection I've got is an admission that we need to not only design interventions well, but also to implement them well and at scale and in a sustainable way. And as someone who comes from a donor, a development organisation, which FCDO is, this is really important. We can spend a lot of time, sometimes years, designing interventions, and then we forget to really see them through, adapt during the implementation. The fourth reflection I have is that teaching at the right level and early childhood education are cost-effective interventions that can help shift the dial in terms of learning. And we know this deeply in the UK. We have had early years education in fits and starts in the UK, but all the evidence shows that when you get it right, it sets children up for the rest of their lives. And that's true in the UK, it's true in Pakistan. The fifth reflection I have is the need to align the curriculum, teaching and examinations. And I know that there's been quite a bit of discussion about data sharing, data systems, ensuring that departments who are involved speak to each other properly across those information sharing systems, that there are feedback loops allowing you to plan and implement and iterate education interventions. So that whole piece around data is incredibly important. The sixth reflection is the value of political support from across the spectrum, including Parliament, to catalyse system reforms and to make them stick. And we heard from Parliamentary Secretary Manaz and other parliamentarians, didn't we, about why it's so important to involve Parliament. And then the seventh reflection I've got is the value of engagement, collaboration and coalitions. And of course, all of you in the room are on a journey together, together with us at the British High Commission. There's so much value in bringing people together to have these difficult debates, to have the exchange. I've enjoyed seeing how people in the room are interacting with people on stage here. It's so valuable. And particularly so when the political temperature is high, as it is in Pakistan at the moment. You know, how much more do we need consensus now on issues like education? And then my eighth reflection is around this question of elite capture and ensuring that the right voices are in the right room at the right time. Again, this is not a problem that is unique to Pakistan, the question of political will to get education policy right. But it is very pertinent for Pakistan, I would say. So I'll leave it there. Finally, I just want to say, you know, today it's International Women's Day. I'm wearing purple. Many of you in the room are wearing purple. So finishing with a sort of feminist point that, you know, if I'm going to do anything, if I'm going to make a commitment myself now, how do I take away the reflections of this conference? What am I going to work on? The key thing for me is the focus on girls' education. It's been a long-standing focus of the British government, of course, but I think the last 2 days have really crystallised the importance of girls' education for me personally, and I was really interested to hear the panel this morning discussing just how far-ranging the impacts of 12 quality years of girls' education can be, not only on a girl's life, but on the health of her future family, on the economic growth of her community and of her province and even of the nation, and even the climate resilience of Pakistan depends on the quality of education that girls receive here. So that is what I'm going to commit to focus on. You will all be making your own commitments, what you will take away from this conference. But overall, just a huge thanks to you all for your really, really positive engagement over the last 2 days. It's been absolutely brilliant, and it just shows the value of getting together after the 2 years of COVID when none of us could meet. What a wonderful thing it is to get everybody in the room again. And final thanks to the team. Do you want to come up on stage, actually? And we can just give you... Come on, team. Come on, everyone. Come on, Judith. Our honoured guests from the UK. Come on, Judith and Rachel. Come on. So, here they are. Just a huge thanks to you all from the FCDO side for everything you've done to put this conference together. Hugely, hugely appreciated. Oh yes, yeah, get a photo, great. Oh, Sahel! Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful evening.